Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. It was supposed to be just another stop on our family road trip, a quick overnight stay at an old hotel in a small town I can't even remember the name of. The building was ancient, with chipped bricks, ivy crawling up the sides, and a creaky wooden sign swinging in the wind that read Willow Crest Inn. It looked more like a place ghosts would go to vacation, but my dad said, "It's cheap, and we're only here for one night." As soon as we stepped inside, the air changed. It smelled old, like books left in a damp basement. The lobby was dim, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. A tall man stood behind the check-in counter. He was pale and thin, and his eyes didn't seem to blink. When my dad told him we had a reservation, the man's mouth stretched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed us a brass key labeled room 204. "You're lucky," he said in a low, raspy voice. "It's one of our quietest rooms." I couldn't explain it, but something about the way he said it gave me chills. Our room was at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The carpet was old and stained, and the lights above flickered every so often. When my dad unlocked the door and we stepped inside, the room looked normal enough. A bed, a dresser, a small TV, but it felt off. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was cold. Not the kind of cold where you can grab a blanket and feel better. It was the kind that made my skin prickle, even though the heater was running. My mom joked about it being ghostly, but I could tell she was uneasy too. As the evening went on, the weirdness piled up. First, there was the bathroom door. Every time I shut it, it would creak open again, even when I was sure I'd closed it tightly. At one point, I slammed it shut out of frustration, and I swear I heard a faint whisper, like someone saying my name. Then, there was the TV. It turned on by itself at 11 p.m., blasting static so loud it woke us all up. My dad muttered something about old wiring and unplugged it, but even after that, I kept hearing faint sounds, like voices, coming from where the TV used to be. By midnight, I was wide awake. My parents had fallen asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the room with us. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the cold was getting worse. That's when I heard it, a knock. It wasn't at the door to the hallway, it was coming from the closet. I froze. The closet door was directly across from my bed, and it was slightly open, just enough to see darkness inside. Knock, knock. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Slowly, I pulled the blanket over my head, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. But the knocking didn't stop. It got louder, more insistent, and then the door creaked open. I peeked out from under the blanket, my breath shaking. The closet was wide open now, but there was nothing inside. Just darkness. Then I saw it. A figure. Pale, with sunken eyes and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. It was standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. My body felt frozen, like something was holding me down. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting slowly to one side, as if it were studying me. Then, it opened its mouth, and a horrible, raspy whisper filled the room. "Get out." The next thing I remember, I was waking up to sunlight streaming through the window. My parents were already packing up, acting like nothing had happened. "Did you guys hear anything weird last night?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mom frowned. "No, why? Did you have a bad dream?" I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but when I looked at the closet, the door was still wide open. As we checked out, I glanced back at the desk clerk. It wasn't the same man from the night before. A woman was working now, and when I mentioned the man, she gave me a puzzled look. "There's no one else on staff," she said. "It's just me." To this day, I can't explain what happened in room 204. My parents insist it was just my imagination, but I know what I saw. I haven't stayed in an old hotel since. When I booked a room at the Silver Lantern Inn, I thought it would be a cozy, quaint stay in the countryside. The reviews online mentioned its charming old-world charm and perfect spot for history buffs. It sounded exactly like the break I needed after a stressful semester at college. Little did I know, I was walking straight into the most terrifying night of my life. The inn was nestled on a hill, surrounded by dense woods. The building was massive and ancient, with weathered stone walls and ivy crawling up to the roof. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the driveway. There was something about the place that felt frozen in time. Too quiet, too still. The woman at the front desk greeted me with a warm smile, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when I told her my name. She fumbled with the keys before handing me one with a large brass tag that read Room 7. Room 7, she said softly, almost like she was trying to convince herself. You'll enjoy the view. Her hesitation made me pause, but I brushed it off. I was tired, and the thought of climbing into a bed sounded better than lingering in the shadowy lobby. The hallway to my room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from small sconces mounted on the wall. The air smelled faintly of lavender, mixed with something earthy, almost like wet soil. My footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floors as I approached my door. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I immediately felt a chill, even though the heater was on. The room was simple, a four-poster bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the woods. It was quaint, but there was something unsettling about it. The first thing I noticed was a mirror on the wall across from the bed. It was massive, framed with ornate carvings, and its surface looked warped, like ripples on a pond. I wasn't a fan of mirrors, especially ones facing the bed, but it wasn't something I could move. I tried to shake off the unease and unpacked my bag. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed and pulled out my phone to scroll for a bit before sleeping. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. At first, I thought it was someone at my door, but when I got up to check, the hallway was empty. I locked the door and crawled back into bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Just as I started to drift off, the knock came again, louder this time. I froze, listening carefully. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the mirror. My heart started racing as I stared at the warped glass. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I saw it, movement in the reflection. At first, it was subtle, like shadows shifting behind me. But as I watched, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing just behind the bed. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, its face just barely visible. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a horrifying grin. It raised a hand, and the knocking started again, louder and more frantic. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone and fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The room was empty, but the knocking continued, echoing through the small space. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, the lights flickered, and the mirror began to rattle on the wall. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it came from everywhere at once. "Help me." I backed toward the door, my heart pounding, but when I tried to turn the knob, it wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me." I turned back to the mirror and froze. The figure was pressing its hands against the glass, its face twisted in agony. "Let me out," it hissed, its voice sharp and guttural. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, with a deafening crash, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The figure was gone, but the cold remained. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, trembling, until I finally worked up the courage to grab my phone and turn on the flashlight. The room was a mess. Glass littered the floor, and the once perfect bed was now twisted and torn, as if something had clawed at it. The mirror, or what was left of it, still hung on the wall, the shards reflecting the dim light like tiny, watchful eyes. Somehow, I made it through the night. I didn't sleep, I couldn't. The moment the sun rose, I packed my things and bolted to the lobby, demanding to check out. The woman at the desk didn't seem surprised. "Room 7?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, too shaken to say much. She sighed, her expression tinged with guilt. "You're not the first. That room, it's been trouble for years. We've tried closing it off, but people always request it. Something about its location, I suppose. The last guest who stayed there, well, let's just say they didn't leave on their own 2 feet." I didn't want to know more. I handed her the key and left without looking back. It's been months since that night at the Silver Lantern Inn, but I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. Every now and then, I catch glimpses of shadows in my bedroom mirror, and I swear I hear faint whispers when the house is quiet. I've tried to convince myself it's all in my head, but deep down, I know the truth. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a weekend getaway with a couple of friends. We'd found a cheap deal online for the Hollow Pines Hotel, a once grand building tucked away in the mountains. The photos made it look charming, like something out of a classic movie. Sprawling halls, elegant furniture, and massive chandeliers. We joked about how it looked haunted, but no one took it seriously. After all, what's a little history without some ghost stories? That's what we thought, anyway. The drive up was long and winding, the road hugging the edge of a cliff. By the time we arrived, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting the hotel in an eerie orange glow. Up close, the place looked more run down than we'd expected. The paint was peeling, the windows dusty, and the sign above the entrance hung at an awkward angle. "It's got character," my friend Leah joked, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The lobby was massive, with high ceilings and an old chandelier that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. A man at the front desk greeted us, his face pale and tired-looking. He handed us a single key for room 308, his bony fingers lingering on it for a moment too long. "You're staying on the 3rd floor?" he asked, his tone oddly flat. "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer right away, just gave a weak smile. "No, no problem. Enjoy your stay." The way he said it made my stomach twist, but I brushed it off. The elevator to the 3rd floor creaked and groaned the entire ride up. When the doors opened, we stepped into a dimly lit hallway. The carpet was worn, the walls scuffed, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. It felt colder up here, too, like the heater didn't quite reach this far. Our room was at the very end of the hall. The door creaked as we opened it, revealing a small space with 2 twin beds, a nightstand, and a window that overlooked the dense woods behind the hotel. The furniture was old but clean, and the bathroom smelled faintly of bleach. "This isn't so bad," Leah said, tossing her bag onto one of the beds. "Yeah, except for the creepy vibe," said my other friend, Ethan, peering out the window. "It feels off up here." I didn't say anything, but I agreed. The room was quiet, too quiet. That night, things started to get weird. It began with the temperature. No matter how much we adjusted the thermostat, the room stayed freezing. We all bundled up in sweaters and blankets, but it didn't help. Then, around midnight, we heard it, footsteps. At first, it sounded like someone walking down the hallway outside, slow and deliberate. But the steps didn't fade away. They stopped right outside our door. Ethan got up to check, looking through the peephole. "There's no one there," he whispered, his voice trembling. The footsteps started again, this time moving inside the room. We all froze, staring at each other as the sound of heavy, deliberate steps moved across the floor. It didn't make sense. We couldn't see anyone, but the noise was unmistakable. It stopped near the window, and the air grew even colder. Leah whispered, "This has to be some kind of joke, right?" But the fear in her eyes said she didn't believe that. Then the window rattled. Ethan, trying to be brave, moved toward it, but before he could reach it, the curtains blew open, even though the window was shut tight. A low, mournful sigh filled the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the glass, something tall and thin, with glowing eyes. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing my bag. But as I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. We tried everything, turning the handle, pushing, pulling, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, almost like a breeze, but soon they grew louder, filling the room with overlapping voices. "Why are you here?" one voice hissed. "You don't belong," another growled. Leah was crying now, clutching my arm. Ethan was pale, his eyes darting around the room. Then, the lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, I could feel something, someone, standing close. The cold was unbearable, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. A faint glow appeared near the window, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A figure standing there. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale and translucent. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of sadness and anger. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Then she raised her hand and pointed to the corner of the room. We all turned to look, and that's when we saw him. A man was standing there, or what used to be a man. His face was gaunt, his skin gray and cracked like old paper. His eyes glowed faintly, and his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice deep and guttural. He took a step toward us, and the air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. "We need to go," Ethan gasped, pulling at the door. The woman by the window suddenly screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that made my ears ring. The man turned toward her, his face contorted with rage. In that moment, the door flew open. We didn't waste any time. Grabbing our things, we bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. The elevator wasn't an option, so we sprinted down the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. When we reached the lobby, the man at the front desk was gone. The place was completely silent, like we were the only people there. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. The next day, I called the hotel to report what had happened, but no one answered. Curious and wanting closure, I did some research online and found out the truth about Hollow Pines Hotel. In the early 1900s, a woman named Eleanor had been staying in room 308 with her husband. He was abusive, and one night, in a fit of rage, he killed her before taking his own life. Guests had reported seeing her spirit, often warning them about the man's vengeful ghost. It's been months since that night, but I still wake up to the sound of footsteps, even in my own home. I don't know if we left the spirits behind or if they followed us. One thing's for sure, I'll never stay in an old hotel again. It was supposed to be a fun detour on my road trip, a stay at Ashmore Manor, an old, historic hotel tucked away in a sleepy little town. I'd read about it online, where it was described as a step back in time and perfect for anyone who loves a touch of mystery. That should have been my first clue. When I arrived, the building loomed over me like a forgotten relic. Its once grand facade was faded, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. The windows were tall and narrow, giving the impression that the hotel itself was watching me. A wooden sign swung in the breeze, creaking softly. There weren't many cars in the lot, just a few scattered here and there. The stillness of the place made my footsteps sound louder than they should have as I climbed the wide stone steps to the entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs. The lobby was grand but worn, with an enormous chandelier hanging overhead, its crystals dull and coated with dust. An old-fashioned desk sat against one wall, and behind it stood an elderly woman with a thin, tight-lipped smile. "Welcome to Ashmore Manor," she said in a voice so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. "Are you staying the night?" I nodded, and she handed me a key attached to a heavy iron ring. The tag read room 15. "It's one of our finest," she said, her eyes flicking toward the staircase. But she hesitated, her smile faltering. "If you hear anything strange, just ignore it. The building is old." Her words sent a small shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. Room 15 was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. The carpet beneath my feet was faded, its floral pattern barely visible anymore. The doors lining the hall were tall and wooden, their brass numbers slightly tarnished. When I reached my room, I hesitated. The air seemed colder here, heavier. But I shook it off, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was simple but charming in its own way. A large four-poster bed sat against one wall, its frame carved with intricate patterns. A small desk and chair were tucked into the corner, and a window overlooked the overgrown garden below. I unpacked my things and flopped onto the bed, grateful for the chance to rest. But as the sun set and darkness crept into the room, the atmosphere shifted. The first sign came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I strained to listen, it was clear the sound was in the room. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I sat up, scanning the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, the sound came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was coming from the wall near the desk. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and moved toward the wall. Pressing my ear against it, I listened. "Please, help me." The voice was clearer now, desperate and full of sorrow. It sounded like a woman, trapped and pleading. I backed away, my stomach twisting. This had to be a trick, right? Maybe the hotel had thin walls, and someone in the next room was talking. But when I opened the door and checked the hallway, it was empty. Room 14 next door was dark, its door slightly ajar. Cautiously, I peeked inside. The room was empty. Dust coated the furniture, and the bed was stripped bare. It hadn't been used in years. I returned to my room, feeling uneasy. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt heavier, colder. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But just as I started to drift off, a loud thud jolted me awake. The noise came from the corner of the room where the desk sat. I turned on the bedside lamp and stared, my breath catching in my throat. The chair had moved. When I'd gone to bed, it had been tucked neatly under the desk. Now, it was pulled out, angled toward the center of the room. I told myself it was nothing, that I must have bumped it earlier without realizing. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The night only got worse. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails dragging across wood, but it grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from the same wall where I'd heard the whispers. I got up, my hands shaking, and moved toward the sound. This time, I didn't press my ear against the wall. Instead, I just stood there, staring. "Please," the voice whispered again, almost a sob. Before I could react, the scratching stopped, and a new sound filled the room. A creaking noise, like someone walking across the floorboards. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward me. I backed away until I hit the wall, my heart racing. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath, even though the heater was on full blast. Then, I saw it. A figure appeared near the desk, a woman, her form pale and translucent. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, her hair hanging in messy curls around her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her mouth moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as she reached out a hand, pointing toward the wall. Her lips moved again, forming the same words over and over. "Help me." Before I could react, she vanished, and the room fell silent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, the lamp on, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I packed my things and headed straight to the front desk. The elderly woman was there again, her expression tired but calm. "How was your stay?" she asked, her voice as soft as before. I hesitated before answering. I think there's something wrong with room 15. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. "You heard her, didn't you?" she said quietly. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. She sighed. Her name was Margaret. She stayed here decades ago, in that very room. She vanished one night, and no one ever found out what happened to her. Some say her spirit is trapped, still searching for someone to help her. I left without another word, driving away from Ashmore Manor as fast as I could. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. The whispers, the scratching, the figure by the desk. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can still hear her voice. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some places hold on to the past too tightly, and some spirits never let go. It was supposed to be an uneventful stop on my way back home. A night at the Blackstone Hotel, a century-old establishment in a small, forgotten town. I didn't pick it for its charm. It was cheap, available, and conveniently located. Little did I know that checking into that hotel would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. The exterior was imposing, its stone walls darkened by years of grime and moss. The towering structure seemed to hunch under the weight of its own age. As I parked my car and walked toward the entrance, a strange sense of unease settled over me. It was as if the building was alive, silently watching my every step. The lobby was dimly lit, with antique furniture arranged in neat clusters. A grand staircase curved up toward the second floor, its banister worn smooth from decades of use. A middle-aged man stood behind the front desk, his expression unreadable. "Checking in?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded and gave him my name. He handed me an old-fashioned brass key attached to a heavy chain. "Room 213, he said, then hesitated. "Just a heads up, the power sometimes flickers at night." "Old wiring." I gave a polite nod, but the warning lingered in my mind as I took the elevator to the second floor. The hallway leading to room 213 was long and narrow, the faded carpet muffling my footsteps. The walls were lined with old photographs of the hotel from its early days. Each frame held smiling faces of guests and staff, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked past. When I reached my room, the air felt colder. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was modest, with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a desk. The only window overlooked the parking lot, where my car sat bathed in the glow of a flickering streetlight. I set my bag down and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from the long drive. I didn't bother unpacking. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. It started with the whispers. I had just turned off the light and climbed into bed when I heard them. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I thought it was someone in the neighboring room, but as I listened more closely, I realized the voices were too faint, too fragmented to belong to a real conversation. It felt as if they were all around me, surrounding me in a cocoon of hushed words I couldn't understand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the old building settling, maybe pipes creaking behind the walls. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt a shift in the air. It grew colder, and the faint smell of damp earth filled the room. Then, I noticed it, a shadow in the corner. At first, I thought it was just the way the light from the street lamp outside hit the furniture. But the shadow moved. It wasn't sudden or jerky. It glided, slow and deliberate, across the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't attached to anything. It was a shape all its own, darker than the surrounding night. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The shadow paused, almost as if it were considering me. The lamp on the nightstand flickered, casting the room into brief moments of darkness. Each time the light came back on, the shadow was closer. I scrambled off the bed, my hands fumbling to turn on the overhead light. But the switch did nothing. The room remained dim, the flickering lamp the only source of illumination. The shadow crept forward, stretching across the floor and up the walls. It wasn't just a shape. It had substance, a weight that seemed to press down on the room. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like a deep exhale from something not quite human. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did nothing to dispel the shadow. If anything, it seemed to grow larger, feeding off the light. The whispers returned, louder now. They weren't fragmented anymore. They were chanting. The words were foreign, guttural, and harsh, filling the room with a sense of dread so heavy it felt like I was being suffocated. Then, the wardrobe door creaked open. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something. On the other side wanted me to know they were there. My flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it at the opening. The inside of the wardrobe was pitch black, far darker than it should have been. And then I saw it. Eyes, two glowing, red orbs stared back at me from the depths of the wardrobe. They were unblinking, filled with malice and hunger. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as a clawed hand emerged, gripping the edge of the door. A deafening crash shattered the moment. The lamp on the nightstand exploded, plunging the room into complete darkness. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The whispers turned into screams, angry, agonized cries that seemed to come from every corner of the room. The shadow loomed over me now, its shape shifting and writhing like smoke. I felt an icy grip around my ankle and screamed, kicking wildly. Somehow, I managed to break free and scramble to the door. My hands fumbled with the lock as the shadow surged toward me, its form stretching and twisting into something monstrous. With a desperate yank, I wrenched the door open and bolted into the hallway. The corridor was empty, silent except for the sound of my ragged breathing. I ran toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing against the walls. When I reached the lobby, the man at the front desk was gone. The entire hotel seemed deserted, as if I were the only person left in the building. I didn't stop to look for him. I grabbed my car keys and ran outside, my shoes skidding on the wet pavement. The drive away from the Blackstone Hotel felt like a blur. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure following me. When I reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. My heart was still racing, and I could barely catch my breath. Curiosity and a need for closure got the better of me. I searched the hotel's name online, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. What I found chilled me to my core. The Blackstone Hotel had a dark history. Decades ago, a man had been found dead in room 213, his body contorted and unrecognizable. Witnesses claimed he had been terrified of something in the room, something no one else could see. Since then, there had been countless reports of strange occurrences, whispers, shadows, and sightings of glowing red eyes. I haven't gone back to the Blackstone Hotel, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in my room. And when I turn off the lights, I swear I see a shadow lurking in the corner, waiting for me to notice. Some places are cursed, their darkness seeping into anyone who dares to enter. The Blackstone Hotel is one of them. It was an accident that brought me to the Crescent Hollow Inn. My car had broken down on a winding, desolate road, miles from the nearest town. The tow truck driver, a grizzled man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, suggested the old inn as the only nearby place to stay the night. "You're lucky," he said, chuckling in a way that didn't feel comforting. The Crescent's got plenty of character. When I arrived, the inn stood at the edge of a dense forest, its silhouette bathed in the eerie glow of the moon. The building was massive, its architecture a mix of Victorian elegance and weathered decay. The once white paint was now gray and flaking, and ivy clung to the walls like the fingers of the forest itself. Inside, the lobby was quiet, its grandeur faded but not forgotten. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, its bulbs flickering. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. An elderly man sat at the front desk, his expression one of practiced politeness. His name tag read Walter. "Welcome to the Crescent Hollow Inn," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with something I couldn't place. "Room for one." I nodded, too tired and frustrated to ask questions. He handed me a heavy brass key marked room 307. "Enjoy your stay," Walter said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But if you hear footsteps at night, stay in your room. It's best not to wander." The warning struck me as odd, but I was too exhausted to press further. The elevator was out of service, so I climbed the creaking staircase to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. The carpet beneath my feet felt spongy, as though it had absorbed decades of secrets. When I unlocked the door to room 307, I was greeted by a faint chill. The room was small but cozy, with a queen-sized bed, an antique dresser, and a single window overlooking the forest. A large mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed, its surface cloudy with age. I set my bag down and flopped onto the bed, letting out a tired sigh. The mattress was firm, the linens crisp and clean. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. The first strange occurrence happened around midnight. I woke up to the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, echoing softly against the wooden floor. I sat up, my heart pounding. Remembering Walter's warning, I stayed in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for them to continue, but they didn't. Instead, there was a soft knock, 3 sharp raps that sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The doorknob rattled, as though someone was trying to open it. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the front desk, but the rattling stopped abruptly. When I worked up the courage to check the peephole, the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just an old building, creaking floors, maybe a guest who got the wrong room. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed the mirror. Its surface seemed different. The cloudy glass now shimmered faintly, as though it were reflecting light from a source I couldn't see. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and stared at the mirror. My reflection was there, but something wasn't right. It moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I watched, my reflection tilted its head to one side, a motion I hadn't made. A cold wave of terror washed over me. I flicked the lamp back on, and the reflection returned to normal. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with that mirror. The second incident was more direct. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again, this time to the sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from the hallway, but from inside the room. The voices were faint and overlapping, impossible to understand. They seemed to come from everywhere at once. I sat up, scanning the room, but it appeared empty. Then I looked at the mirror. The whispers grew louder, and the surface of the glass seemed to ripple, as though it were water disturbed by a breeze. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and approached the mirror. The closer I got, the more the whispers intensified. When I was just inches away, the rippling stopped, and the glass became perfectly still. Then, a face appeared. It wasn't my reflection. The face belonged to a woman, her features pale and ghostly. Her eyes were hollow, dark sockets that seemed to stare straight through me. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. The mirror returned to normal, my terrified reflection staring back at me. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. Walter answered on the second ring. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone calm, almost too calm. "There's something wrong with my room," I stammered. "The mirror. There's a face in the mirror." There was a long pause. "You're in 307, aren't you?" he said finally. "Yes." He sighed. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you. That room. It's connected to her." "Who?" I demanded. "The lady of the glass," he said quietly. "She's been here for as long as I can remember. Most guests never see her, but some do." I wanted to leave, but Walter convinced me to stay in the room until morning. "She doesn't harm anyone," he assured me. "She just watches." But I couldn't sleep. The whispers continued, softer now, like a lullaby meant for someone long gone. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, the room grew warmer and the oppressive feeling lifted. I packed my things and hurried downstairs, eager to leave. Walter was waiting for me at the front desk. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept either. "I'm sorry for your experience," he said, sliding a handwritten note across the counter. The note read, "Crescent Hollow Inn, 1918. A young woman, despondent after her fiancé's death in the war, took her own life in room 307. Her spirit remains, bound to the mirror where she last saw herself. I left the inn as fast as I could, but I've never forgotten that night. Even now, mirrors make me uneasy. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, I think I see her, watching, waiting, a silent reminder that some places never let go of their ghosts. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a chance to escape the chaos of everyday life. My best friend Emily and I had planned a getaway to Ashmore Manor, a grand old hotel nestled in the mountains. Built in the late 1800s, the hotel had a reputation for its old-world charm and a few ghost stories. I didn't believe in ghosts. To me, the supernatural was just something people talked about to scare themselves. But by the end of the weekend, Ashmore Manor would make me question everything. The building was stunning, its stone walls framed by towering pines and shrouded in mist. A sprawling veranda wrapped around the front, with rocking chairs arranged neatly for guests to enjoy the view. Inside, the lobby was a blend of elegance and antiquity. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the golden light. A grand staircase curved upward, leading to the guest rooms. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a thin smile, handed us the keys to room 418. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her tone polite but distant. "And remember, the hotel has rules. No loud noises after 10 p.m., no exploring the basement, and," she hesitated, "if you hear knocking in the middle of the night, don't answer the door." Emily and I exchanged a glance. "Why would someone knock at night?" Emily asked, half laughing. The receptionist's smile didn't waver. "Just a precaution," she said before turning her attention to the next guest. Our room was on the 4th floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of somber-looking men and women. Each painting seemed to follow us with its eyes as we passed. Room 418 was cozy but dated, with floral wallpaper, a 4-poster bed, and an antique dresser. A single window overlooked the forest, its glass slightly warped with age. "This place is creepy in a cool way," Emily said as she flopped onto the bed. I nodded, unpacking my bag. "Feels like we've stepped back in time." We spent the afternoon exploring the grounds, admiring the gardens, and hiking a nearby trail. By the time we returned, the sun was setting, and the hotel took on a different atmosphere. The shadows lengthened, and the air felt heavier, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The first incident happened around midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, while Emily slept soundly beside me. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the radiator. Then I heard it, a faint knock at the door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but it came again, 3 deliberate knocks. I froze, remembering the receptionist's warning. My heart pounded as I stared at the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, but the knocking continued, slow and rhythmic. I glanced at Emily, who was still asleep, and debated whether to wake her. But before I could, the doorknob jiggled, as though someone was trying to open it. "Who's there?" I demanded, louder this time. The knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, I told Emily what had happened. She laughed it off, saying it was probably a prank by another guest. I wanted to believe her, but something about the knocking felt wrong. We spent the day exploring the nearby town, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. But when we returned to the hotel that evening, the sense of unease returned. That night, Emily fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake, my nerves on edge. I kept staring at the door, half expecting to hear the knocking again. Instead, it came from the wall. At first, it was faint, like someone tapping lightly on the other side. But it grew louder and more insistent, as though whoever, or whatever, was there wanted to come through. I sat up, my pulse racing. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She groaned and turned over. "What?" "Listen," I said. The tapping stopped. She gave me a tired look. "You're freaking yourself out," she said. "Go to sleep." But I couldn't. Around 3 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, and the air felt thick and heavy. Then I saw it. At the foot of the bed, a shadow began to form. It was faint at first, like smoke curling in the air, but it grew darker, more defined. It was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, his features obscured by the darkness. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, my limbs frozen in place. The figure stood there, unmoving, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. Leave, it whispered, its voice low and raspy. I wanted to scream, to wake Emily, but no sound came out. The figure took a step closer, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. When I opened them, the room was empty. The next morning, I told Emily everything. She looked worried but still skeptical. Maybe it was a nightmare, she suggested. I wasn't so sure. We decided to spend our last day at the hotel trying to uncover its history. The receptionist was tight-lipped, but one of the housekeepers, a young woman named Clara, was more forthcoming. This place has a dark past, she said in a hushed voice. In the early 1900s, a man named Mr. Ashmore owned the hotel. He was cruel. Guests and staff alike vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some say their spirits are still here. Trapped? I asked. Clara nodded. They're drawn to room 418. That's where Mr. Ashmore lived and died. That night, I didn't want to stay in the room, but Emily convinced me we'd be fine. We'll leave in the morning, she said. Just one more night. We barricaded the door with a chair and left the lights on. But it didn't help. Around midnight, the knocking returned, louder this time. Emily and I stared at the door, our breath hitching with each knock. Then, the chair we'd placed against the door slid away on its own, as though invisible hands were moving it. Get the keys, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed the keys from the nightstand, but before we could make it to the door, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the cold returned, biting and oppressive. Then came the whispers. They were everywhere, soft, overlapping voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The shadow appeared again, this time at the center of the room. It wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the walls, their forms pale and translucent. Men, women, children, all with hollow eyes and expressions of despair. They surrounded us, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. Help us, one of them pleaded. Emily and I bolted for the door, fumbling with the keys. The figures didn't chase us, but their presence pressed against us, suffocating and relentless. We finally burst into the hallway, slamming the door behind us. The whispers stopped, but the silence was almost worse. We didn't wait until morning to leave. We packed our bags and drove through the night, not stopping until we were miles away from Ashmore Manor. I've tried to forget what happened, to convince myself it was a shared hallucination or a trick of the mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear knocking at my door, and when I look into the mirror, I see shadows that don't belong. I had never heard of the Willowgate Hotel before that trip. It wasn't part of my plan to stay there. It was just a last-minute decision. My flight had been delayed, and by the time I reached the small, unfamiliar town, it was too late to drive the remaining distance to my destination. The hotel came up on a quick online search, a historic building tucked away on the edge of the town square. The website boasted of its charm and old-world elegance. The photos showed a towering, ivy-covered structure with arched windows and an inviting glow. It looked like a perfect place to crash for the night. But pictures can lie. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up to the hotel was how much darker it looked in person. The ivy was more like a tangled mess, and the glow I had seen in the photos was replaced by dim, flickering lights. The lobby was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her 50s with a severe bun and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Willowgate," she said, sliding a ledger toward me. "Sign in here." It was strange to use an actual ledger instead of a computer, but I didn't think much of it at the time. As I signed my name, I noticed how few entries there were. Just a handful of guests, despite the size of the hotel. "You're in room 214, the woman said, handing me a brass key attached to a worn leather tag. "Second floor, end of the hallway. Enjoy your stay." Her voice was clipped, almost dismissive, and as I walked away, I felt her eyes follow me until I disappeared up the stairs. The second floor was worse than the lobby. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the walls lined with old, faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. A faint hum filled the air, almost like electricity, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. Room 214 was at the very end, just as the receptionist had said. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the hum seemed to grow louder. The room was functional. A queen-sized bed with a faded floral bedspread, a small desk, a single armchair, and an old-fashioned wardrobe that loomed in the corner. The air felt stale, and the overhead light flickered slightly before settling into a dim glow. I shrugged off my unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The first strange thing happened around 1 a.m. I woke up to the sound of knocking. It wasn't at my door, but at the wall behind the bed. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I waited for a few minutes, but the knocking didn't return. Telling myself it was probably just the pipes or an old building settling, I lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The second incident was harder to dismiss. I woke again around 3 a.m., this time to a soft rustling sound. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the wardrobe. The door to the wardrobe was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The rustling stopped. I stared at the wardrobe, my breath hitching, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I climbed out of bed and approached it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I yanked the door open. It was empty. Feeling foolish but still unnerved, I closed the wardrobe firmly and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive. I found myself staring at the wardrobe, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. When morning came, I tried to brush off the events of the night. Over breakfast in the small dining room, I overheard 2 other guests talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear it last night?" One of them whispered. "The knocking?" The other replied, looking pale. "Yeah." And the footsteps. They stopped right outside my door. I couldn't help but join in. "You heard knocking too?" I asked. They both looked at me, their eyes wide. "What room are you in?" the first guest asked. 214, I said. They exchanged a glance. "Be careful," the second one said. "This place, it's not normal." That night, I was tempted to check out and find another place to stay, but something kept me there. Curiosity? Stubbornness? I'm not sure. The receptionist barely acknowledged me when I passed through the lobby, and the hum in the hallway seemed louder than before. I double-checked the locks on the door and even wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. Then I climbed into bed, determined to sleep through the night. I didn't. The knocking started again, this time louder and more insistent. It wasn't just at the wall. It came from the wardrobe, the ceiling, even the floor. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to seep into my head, growing louder and louder until I thought I would scream. Then it stopped. I lowered my hands, my breath ragged. The room was silent, but the oppressive feeling remained. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the room, though there was no source of light to cast it. It slid along the floor, up the wall, and stopped just below the ceiling. It began to take shape, a figure, its limbs impossibly long, its face a dark void. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind racing with terror. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was suffocating, as though it were pressing down on me. "Leave," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. "This is not your place." I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring at the shadowy figure, unable to move or speak. At some point, I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The room was as it had been when I first arrived, ordinary, unassuming. The wardrobe was closed, and the air no longer felt heavy. But I didn't feel safe. I packed my things and left without checking out. As I drove away from the Willowgate Hotel, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure watching me leave. I didn't, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. To this day, I don't know what I encountered at the Willowgate. I've tried to research the hotel's history, but it's as though it doesn't exist. The website is gone, and the few mentions I've found online are vague and unhelpful. But I'll never forget the shadow, or the warning it gave me. Some places are meant to be forgotten, and some doors are better left unopened. It started as a spontaneous adventure. My friends and I had been driving through the countryside, looking for a weekend escape. We stumbled across the Silver Pines Inn, a massive, dilapidated hotel tucked away in a forgotten corner of the woods. "Let's stay here," Kayla said, leaning over the steering wheel to get a better look at the looming structure. I wasn't so sure. The hotel was eerie, its once white exterior now gray with years of grime. The windows glinted like empty eyes in the fading sunlight. "It's just for one night," Marcus chimed in. "Think of the stories we'll have." Reluctantly, I agreed. That decision would haunt me forever. The lobby was even stranger than the exterior. It was cavernous, with a vaulted ceiling and faded red carpet that reeked of mildew. The desk clerk was an older man with deep-set eyes and a nervous demeanor. "We don't get many visitors these days," he said as he handed us a single key. The tag read room 305. Kayla, always the chatty one, asked, "Why is it so quiet?" "This place is huge." The clerk didn't answer. Instead, he shuffled away, muttering something under his breath that none of us could catch. The elevator was broken, so we took the stairs, lugging our bags up to the third floor. The hallway stretched on endlessly, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of our footsteps. Room 305 was unusual. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1950s. A large mirror hung on one wall, its surface warped and smudged. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. "What's with the vibe in here?" Marcus asked, flopping onto the creaky bed. "I kind of like it," Kayla said, snapping photos of the room. "It's got character." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, the real horror began. It was around midnight when I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from inside the hotel. A soft, rhythmic knocking. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, nudging Kayla. She groaned, half asleep. "Probably the pipes." But it didn't sound like pipes. The knocking grew louder, moving down the hallway. It stopped outside our door. "Who's there?" Marcus called out, his voice groggy. There was no response, just silence so deep it made my ears ring. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Marcus jumped out of bed, grabbing the chair from the desk to wedge it under the handle. "Nope, not tonight," he muttered, trying to sound brave. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more frantic, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was desperate to get in. And then it stopped. The next morning, none of us mentioned the incident. Maybe we were too shaken, or maybe we didn't want to admit that we were scared. We decided to explore the hotel instead. Kayla wanted to check out the ballroom she'd seen on the way in, and Marcus was curious about the basement. The ballroom was a vast, empty space, its floor covered in a layer of dust so thick our footprints were the only marks. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull and lifeless. "What's that?" Kayla pointed to a door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. "Let's check it out," Marcus said, already heading toward it. I hesitated, a sense of dread washing over me. Maybe we shouldn't, but Kayla and Marcus were already inside. The room wasn't a ballroom at all. It was small and cramped, with walls lined in cracked tiles. In the center stood a single chair, its seat stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. "What is this place?" Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus leaned closer to the chair. "Looks like some kind of holding room?" I backed out, my stomach churning. "Let's go. Now." That night, the knocking returned. It wasn't just at our door this time. It was all around us. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor seemed to vibrate with the sound. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. Kayla grabbed her phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, moving toward us from down the hall. "Someone's coming," Kayla whispered, her face pale. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart hammering. The footsteps stopped right outside, and then the door began to rattle. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to sleep. At some point, the noises stopped, but the oppressive feeling in the room remained. The next morning, we decided to leave. As we packed our bags, Marcus noticed something strange. "Hey," he said, pointing to the mirror. "That wasn't there before." Etched into the glass, as though scratched with a blade, were 3 words: "Room with no number." We didn't stick around to ask questions. On our way out, I stopped by the front desk to return the key. The clerk was nowhere to be found, but another guest, an older woman, stood nearby. "Leaving already?" she asked, her tone oddly knowing. "Yeah," I said. "This place is unsettling." She nodded, her expression grim. "It always has been. Did you hear the story?" "What story?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Years ago, there was a room here, a room with no number. People said it didn't exist, but those who stayed in it, they were never the same. Some disappeared entirely." My blood ran cold. "What happened to it?" "They sealed it off. But the hotel's old. Sometimes it shifts." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't want to know. As we drove away from the Silver Pines Inn, I glanced back at the looming building. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the window of room 305, watching us leave. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. And yet, even now, I can't shake the feeling that the room, the one with no number, is still there, waiting for its next guest. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a break from the stresses of school and life. My friend Emily and I had been planning it for weeks. We had found an old, charming hotel online called the Hollowbrook Hotel, located in a small town deep in the mountains. The photos made it look cozy, with antique furniture, a fireplace in every room, and beautiful views of the surrounding forest. We were looking forward to disconnecting from everything and just relaxing for a couple of days. When we arrived, it looked exactly like the pictures. Well, almost. The hotel had a kind of vintage charm, but there was a certain heaviness about it that I couldn't quite place. The air was cool, and the sky was overcast, casting a gloomy shadow over the area. The road leading up to the hotel was long and winding, lined with old trees whose branches creaked in the wind. We drove past a couple of abandoned houses on the way, which made the entire area feel more isolated than we had expected. Emily, ever the optimist, reassured me, "It's just a small town. We'll be fine." The front of the hotel was impressive, with large stone steps leading up to heavy wooden doors. When we entered, the lobby smelled of wood and old books, and the grand chandelier overhead was a bit dusty but still beautiful. There was a fireplace, but it wasn't lit, and a long hallway stretched out in front of us. A woman stood behind the desk, her face pale, almost too pale, and her eyes dark, like she hadn't slept in days. She smiled as we approached. "Welcome to the Hollowbrook Hotel," she said in a soft voice. "I trust you have a reservation?" We nodded, and she handed us a brass key with a faded tag that read, "Room 302." The elevator was out of order, so we had to take the stairs to the 3rd floor. As we walked up, the creaky wooden steps echoed in the silence. The hallways were narrow, and the walls were adorned with portraits that seemed to watch us as we passed. There was something off about them. Their eyes followed us, and I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable under their gaze. Room 302 was at the very end of the hall. When we opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the coldness. The air was freezing, and the warmth from the lobby seemed to vanish the moment we stepped inside. The room was large, with an antique 4-poster bed, a heavy wooden wardrobe, and a writing desk covered with dust. The curtains were drawn tightly, blocking out the view of the outside. It was as if the room hadn't been used in years. Emily immediately moved to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. "This place is so old," Emily exclaimed, "but it has character." I didn't respond. I was too busy feeling an odd sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The room was too quiet, and I noticed something strange. On the far wall, above the bed, there was a large, ornate mirror, but it wasn't reflecting anything. When I looked into it, I only saw darkness, as if the glass had been replaced with a void. Maybe the lighting is weird, I thought, but I couldn't deny the discomfort that lingered in my chest. That night, After dinner in the small dining room, we decided to turn in early. I was exhausted, and I figured I'd get some rest before we explored the town the next day. We chatted for a bit, but soon, Emily fell asleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. And then, I heard it. Whispers, soft and low, coming from somewhere in the room. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out any words. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still, but the air felt thick, almost oppressive. I was about to wake Emily when I heard the whispers again, clearer this time, and I realized they were coming from the mirror. I stood up slowly, drawn to the mirror as if something inside it was calling to me. My reflection stared back at me, but something was different. Behind my reflection, in the mirror, I could see faint shapes, figures, shadows, moving, shifting in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It felt like I was looking into another world. I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing, but as I did, I heard footsteps in the hall. I turned, startled, but the footsteps stopped abruptly, and the door to our room creaked open. My pulse quickened as I glanced at Emily, who was still fast asleep. I ran to the door and slammed it shut, my hands shaking. What was happening? Was I imagining it? But then, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They sounded like voices, male and female, calling my name, echoing in the room. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were warning me, pleading with me to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, about to call the front desk, but the moment I unlocked the screen, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped even further. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin, and it felt like the walls were closing in around me. The whispers became frantic, almost desperate. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Emily, wake up." She groggily opened her eyes and looked around, confused. "What is it?" "I don't know, but something's wrong with this room. We need to leave." But Emily didn't move. Instead, she looked toward the mirror, her eyes widening. "Do you see them?" she whispered. I turned to the mirror, and for the first time, I saw it. The shapes, the figures, clear as day. There were people in the mirror. They were standing, their faces pale and twisted, their eyes hollow. They stared at us, their mouths moving as if they were speaking, but the whispers were too faint to hear. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open, and the figure of an old woman stood in the doorway, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. Her hair was wild and unkempt, and her eyes were black as coal. She stepped into the room, her feet making no sound on the floor. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You should never have come to Hollowbrook." The next thing I remember, I was standing in the hallway. My head was spinning, and I felt dizzy. I glanced around, but the hotel was different now. The walls were covered in cracks, the floors warped and sagging. The hallway was longer than before, stretching endlessly into darkness. The front desk was gone, and the place was eerily silent, except for the whispers that seemed to come from all around us. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. I searched frantically through the hotel, calling her name, but the deeper I went, the more distorted the hotel became. I could hear her voice now, faint and distant, calling to me from somewhere far away. I followed the sound, through dark corridors and crumbling rooms, until I reached a door at the very end of the hall. It was the only door that wasn't closed, and it beckoned me forward. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a small, dimly lit room, but what caught my attention was the mirror on the wall, identical to the one in our room. But this time, it wasn't just my reflection I saw. Behind me, in the mirror, I saw Emily. She was standing there, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She was reaching out, but the distance between us seemed infinite. I ran to the mirror, desperate to grab her hand, but just as my fingers brushed against the glass, she vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. The sunlight streamed through the window, and the hotel seemed normal again. But Emily was gone. There was no sign of her. No note, no message, nothing. I left the hotel without looking back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Hollowbrook Hotel was still watching me. And every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, "You shouldn't have come." It wasn't supposed to be a long stay. My best friend Megan and I had been planning a road trip through the old, forgotten parts of the country, trying to find places with history, mystery, and just enough adventure to make the weekend memorable. We found the Pinecrest Hotel online. The photos were rustic and charming, filled with old-world charm that promised a getaway from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. What the photos didn't show was the chilling, lingering sense of unease that would follow us through every creaking hallway. We arrived at dusk, the sky painted with hues of purple and orange, the air crisp and cool. The Pinecrest Hotel was tucked at the edge of a dense pine forest, its exterior a faded yellow with green shutters and an expansive front porch. The moment I saw it, a slight shiver ran down my spine. There was something ancient about the place, something that hinted at years of untold stories hidden behind its tall, narrow windows. "Perfect," Megan said, seemingly unbothered by the hotel's quiet, almost ominous vibe. "It looks like something right out of a novel." I smiled weakly. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just an old hotel. The front door creaked as we pushed it open, and inside, a bell on the counter rang out with a sound far too loud for the empty space. The lobby was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral. The check-in desk was manned by a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit, his face pale, and his eyes slightly sunken, like he hadn't seen daylight in days. "Welcome to the Pinecrest," he said, his voice flat. "How can I help you?" "We have a reservation," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "Room 305. He nodded, handed over a heavy brass key, and gave us directions to the third floor. "You'll be comfortable, but, be careful with the windows in the room. They're old." We thanked him and made our way up the narrow staircase, the old wood creaking under our feet with each step. The second floor felt even darker, the hallways lined with old, tarnished mirrors and paintings of landscapes long forgotten. The third floor was quieter, eerily so. The air felt thicker here, the temperature colder as we approached room 305 at the far end of the hallway. When we entered the room, I immediately noticed how it felt like it had been stuck in time. The furniture was old but not charming, just worn. The bed had an iron frame, and the quilt was faded, the patterns nearly impossible to make out. The curtains were thick and drawn shut, blocking out any natural light. The whole room smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust. "I think this place could use a little TLC," Megan joked, bouncing onto the bed. "But hey, we've had worse." I forced a smile. She was right, I guess. It was old, but it wasn't unlivable. Still, there was something about the room, an unsettling presence that I couldn't shake. We decided to explore the hotel before it got too dark. The hallways were eerily quiet, and as we passed room 307, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Inside, I could see a dim light flickering. "Should we check it out?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but curiosity got the better of me, and I nodded. We pushed the door open gently, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was dark, save for the single light above a small writing desk. A large mirror hung on the opposite wall, its surface cloudy, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The air was stale, and the faint scent of something sweet and rotten lingered in the room. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself. It was the figure in the mirror. A shadowy figure stood just behind the desk, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't clear, but I could make out the silhouette of a person, tall and thin, with a long coat that seemed to ripple in the air, even though there was no breeze. I gasped and backed away. "Megan," I whispered urgently, "did you see that?" Megan turned to look but saw nothing. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing there." I stared at the mirror, my heart pounding, but the figure was gone. There was no sign of it, just the same dusty reflection of the room. I swear there was someone, I stammered. But Megan just shook her head. Maybe you're just tired. Come on, let's get back to our room, she said, tugging at my arm. I didn't argue, but the unsettling feeling lingered as we made our way back to room 305. That night, the strange occurrences started. It began with a soft scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, but then it grew louder, like fingernails dragging against the wood. Megan was already asleep beside me, but I lay awake, listening. It came from the ceiling. No, not the ceiling, the floor above us. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, and in the silence, I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth above our room. The sound was so distinct, so clear. It was as if someone was walking around up there, right above our bed. I tried to ignore it, but the footsteps grew louder, heavier. Whoever was up there was getting closer. I pulled the blankets over my head, hoping it was just my imagination. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, faster, and then they abruptly stopped directly above us. Is someone in here? I whispered, terrified. Megan stirred but didn't wake. I glanced around the room. The mirror on the wall, which I had tried to ignore, now seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. A figure was moving in the reflection, and as I watched, it started to take shape, tall, with a long coat, exactly like the one I had seen earlier in room 307. Get up, I hissed at Megan, shaking her by the shoulder. There's something in here. She sat up quickly, looking confused, but when she turned toward the mirror, the figure was gone. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. We need to leave, I said, my voice trembling. Calm down, Megan said, grabbing my wrist. There's nothing here. Let's just go back to sleep. I didn't care. I couldn't breathe, couldn't stay in that room for another minute. I ran to the window, but when I pulled the curtains open, I saw something I wish I hadn't. Across the parking lot, standing beneath the dim light of the street lamp, was the figure, just like the one in the mirror. It was watching the hotel, its head tilted at an odd angle. As soon as I saw it, it moved, vanishing into the darkness. I froze, too terrified to speak. The figure was real. I knew it was real. The next morning, I tried to tell Megan everything that had happened, but she just laughed it off. You probably had a nightmare, she said. I know this place is old and kind of creepy, but it's just an old hotel. Nothing's going to hurt us. But as we packed up to leave, the man at the front desk gave us a long, unreadable look. Hope you had a good stay, he said, his voice hollow. Actually, I asked, is there a room 307? He nodded slowly. There was. Many years ago. But it's been closed for a while now. Closed? The previous guest. Well, they disappeared. A chill ran through me. What happened? He didn't answer. He just turned away, his back to us, as if he had said all he needed to. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to leave the Pinecrest Hotel, to get as far away from it as possible. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time, and through the front windows, I could see the reflection of the hotel. In the window of room 307, I could just make out the figure, tall, thin, with a long coat, standing silently, watching us leave. And I knew then that it would never leave. Not really. It had been a long week, and I was in desperate need of a break. My cousin Chloe and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We wanted to explore a small, remote town away from the noise of the city. After some searching, we came across Ashwood Manor, an old hotel nestled deep in the woods. The reviews were mixed, but the place had character, vintage furniture, a grand staircase, and enough history to make it sound like something out of a mystery novel. Despite a few warning comments about the hotel's oddities, we decided it was perfect for a quiet retreat. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an eerie golden light across the landscape. Ashwood Manor stood in front of us like a relic from another time. Its brick facade weathered by years of neglect, ivy crawling up the sides. The hotel seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The surrounding trees swayed in the wind, their branches groaning, as if warning us to turn back. But we shrugged off the feeling and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was dimly lit, with antique chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and old paintings of landscapes and people I couldn't recognize. The front desk was manned by a frail-looking woman with graying hair, her features sharp, almost gaunt. Her smile was thin, like it had been practiced over years of disinterest. "Welcome to Ashwood Manor," she said, her voice soft but carrying a hint of something strange, as though she had not spoken to anyone in ages. "I trust you have a reservation?" We nodded, and she handed us a set of brass keys, each with a room number engraved on them. "Your rooms are on the second floor," she said. "Room 210 for you, and room 212 for your cousin." She didn't mention anything else, just a brief, awkward smile before turning back to the old ledger in front of her. Chloe and I exchanged glances but said nothing. We made our way up the winding staircase, the wood creaking beneath our feet. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mothballs, and the atmosphere felt heavy, like we were intruding on a forgotten space. The hallway was narrow, with rooms on either side, and the floors creaked as we walked. When we reached our room, I immediately noticed how cold it was inside. The windows were closed, but the air felt damp and chilly, as if the building itself was holding onto some sort of cold secret. The room had a large canopy bed, its frame carved with intricate designs that looked as though they could tell stories if they could speak. A faded rug covered most of the wooden floor, and the walls were lined with old wallpaper that was peeling at the edges. On the opposite wall, there was an antique mirror, its silver frame tarnished with age. "Wow, this place is seriously old," Chloe said, bouncing on the bed. "But I kinda like it. It has this vintage vibe, don't you think?" I smiled, but the unease in my chest didn't go away. It felt like the room was watching us, and the heavy silence made my thoughts seem louder. I tried to shake off the feeling and unpacked my bag. We spent the rest of the evening exploring the hotel, but it wasn't long before I realized something was off. The atmosphere in Ashwood Manor was unlike any other hotel I had stayed in. It wasn't just the age of the place. It was the feeling of being watched, like something was lurking in the corners of every room. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to keep us on edge. By the time we returned to our rooms, the sun had set, and the hotel seemed even more desolate. The long hallway was dark, the only light coming from a single dim bulb above us. I walked to my room, opened the door, and stepped inside. The air was colder now, and the silence was suffocating. I shivered and closed the door behind me, but as soon as I turned to look around, I froze. The mirror, once clear, was now fogged up, even though I hadn't touched it. I walked closer to it, my heart pounding in my chest. In the foggy surface, I could just make out faint shapes, shadows, like figures moving behind the glass. I blinked, and they were gone. I turned away, my breath coming faster. "It's just the old windows," I told myself, trying to calm down. I grabbed my phone to call Chloe, but before I could dial, I heard a soft knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? I opened the door cautiously, only to find no one there. The hallway was empty, the same dim light hanging from the ceiling. I stepped out into the hall, calling for Chloe, but there was no answer. I felt a growing sense of dread as I walked down the corridor toward her room. When I reached room 212, the door was slightly ajar. My hand trembled as I pushed it open, but the room was empty. Chloe wasn't there. "Chloe," I called, but my voice echoed, swallowed by the silence. I turned around to leave, but something caught my eye, a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, its features hidden by the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone, just like that. I ran back to my room, heart pounding. I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains open, desperate for some light. But as the moonlight poured into the room, I could see something else. The mirror, again. This time, it was completely fogged up, and the shapes in it were clearer. I could see them now, figures with distorted faces, their eyes black and hollow, staring at me. They were reaching out from the mirror, their fingers tapping against the glass, but there was no sound. I screamed and backed away, my mind racing. The figures disappeared, but the air in the room felt thick, like the walls themselves were closing in. My breathing became shallow, and my vision started to blur. Then, I heard a whisper, soft at first, then louder, coming from the mirror, the walls, everywhere. "Leave, now," the voice seemed to say, each word punctuated by an eerie chill. I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my bag and rushed out the door, my mind racing. I needed to find Chloe. The hallway was even darker than before. The dim light above flickered and buzzed as I made my way toward her room again. But when I reached room 212, it was locked. I pounded on the door, but no one answered. Panic surged through me. Chloe had to be in there, but she wasn't responding. I was about to go downstairs to the front desk when the door to room 212 creaked open on its own. "Chloe," I called, stepping inside. The room was dark, and the bed was empty. The window was wide open, and the curtains fluttered in the wind. But what caught my attention was the mirror, reflecting the dark hallway behind me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The figure I had seen earlier, the one in the hallway, was standing in the mirror. But this time, I could see its face clearly. It was an old woman, her features twisted in a permanent expression of horror. Her eyes were black, empty voids, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, horrified, but before I could escape, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to face the mirror once again, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the mirror was no longer just standing. It was moving, coming closer, its hands pressed against the glass, and its lips formed words I couldn't hear. And then, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was still empty. But as I turned back to the mirror, the old woman was now standing right behind me, her hands stretching toward me. I screamed, but the room went dark. I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. I sat up, disoriented. Was it all a nightmare? But as I looked around, I noticed something. The mirror, the one that had terrified me, was gone. In its place was a blank wall. I jumped out of bed and looked around the room, but there was no sign of Chloe. I rushed downstairs to the front desk, where the woman from the night before was still sitting, her expression unchanged. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. "Where's my cousin?" The woman didn't respond right away. She just stared at me, her gaze unfathomable. "She checked out this morning," she said finally, her voice eerily calm. "I'm afraid she won't be coming back." I turned to leave, but as I walked toward the door, I glanced back at the front desk. The woman was gone, replaced by an old portrait of a woman who looked strikingly similar to the figure in the mirror. The portrait's eyes were dark, hollow, just like hers. I never went back to Ashwood Manor, and I'll never forget the echoing whispers that followed me out the door. "Leave, now." The Halston Hotel wasn't on any tourist map. It wasn't listed in any guidebooks, and the online reviews were sparse, leaving only rumors behind. A small, unassuming building located in a quiet, forgotten town. It was a relic of the past, hidden away behind decades of neglect. But it had what we were looking for: seclusion, charm, and a story. I wanted to escape the city's noise, and my friend Nate, always up for a little adventure, was happy to join me. What we didn't expect was how quickly we'd find ourselves tangled in the hotel's chilling past. We drove for hours, following the directions given to us by a local gas station attendant. "Halston Hotel? You mean the old place on the hill? I'd be careful if I were you," he said, his voice dropping as if he were sharing a secret. "People say it's, well, haunted. But that's just talk. Probably nothing. Just don't stay in room 13. Nobody does." Naturally, his cryptic warning only piqued our interest. I had always been intrigued by abandoned places and their ghost stories, and Nate loved anything that involved a challenge. So, when we finally arrived, we were both excited, albeit with a small, strange sense of unease. The hotel was exactly as the attendant described: old and unkempt, with its once grand stone exterior now weathered by years of neglect. The front steps were cracked, the paint on the doors peeling. But despite its dilapidated condition, it held a certain eerie beauty, like a forgotten relic that hadn't yet given up on existing. The lobby smelled faintly of mothballs and aged wood, and it was far colder inside than it had been outside. A small reception desk sat in the corner, behind which stood a woman with sharp features and a worn expression. Her eyes were dark and deep-set, like she hadn't slept in years, but her smile was warm, welcoming, and almost practiced. "Welcome to the Halston," she said, her voice soft and gravelly. "I'm Mary. I'll get you checked in." We gave her our names, and she handed over 2 rusty brass keys. One was labeled Room 12, the other Room 13. "Room 13 is off limits," she said, her eyes flicking to the key before quickly returning to us. "I'll keep that one for myself. Just stay in Room 12. It's more comfortable." Her tone grew more hesitant, like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. "All right, thanks," I said, glancing at Nate, who looked both curious and amused by the strange exchange. We took the keys and made our way to the second floor, which, just like the lobby, had a strange sense of heaviness. The old carpet underfoot seemed to sag in places, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Room 12 was at the end of the hall, its door cracked slightly open. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished, an old bed with a wrought iron frame, a desk covered in dust, and a cracked mirror on the far wall. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the nightstand. The window was covered by thick curtains, shutting out the daylight completely. "This place gives me the creeps," Nate muttered, walking over to the window and pulling back the curtains. Outside, the view revealed a vast, overgrown yard that led to the edge of a dense forest. The trees seemed to reach toward the hotel, like they were creeping in to reclaim the land. "Yeah, it's definitely got that vibe," I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was more disturbed by the room itself or by the unsettling quiet of the hotel. We were the only guests, as far as we could tell, and there were no sounds of life from the other rooms. It felt like we were the only people in the world. After a brief, uncomfortable silence, we decided to explore the hotel. It was strange to walk through its empty halls, the air thick with dust and the weight of years. The more I walked, the more the place seemed to warp around me, like it was bending reality, playing tricks on my senses. At one point, I wandered into the hotel's old dining area. The tables were covered with white cloths, but they were yellowed with age. The chairs, which once might have been elegant, were now weathered and broken, scattered around the room. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me as I explored the room. The silence was oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, stretching further the longer I stayed. "Where are you?" Nate's voice echoed from the hallway, pulling me out of my thoughts. I hurried back to the main corridor to find him standing near a door at the end of the hall. "I was just looking around," I said, but his eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on the door he was standing near. It was Room 13. "Don't look at that," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. I didn't know why, but something about Room 13 called to me. It felt like it was waiting, like it wanted to be opened. I turned away from it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking just behind the door. That night, as the hotel seemed to sink deeper into silence, we settled into our respective rooms. The heavy air that hung in the hallway followed me into my room, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something wasn't right. I crawled into bed, pulled the thick blankets around me, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. It started with whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. They were faint at first, barely there, but as the minutes dragged on, they grew louder, sharper. I couldn't make out any words, just the eerie sound of people talking in a language I couldn't understand. I tossed and turned, trying to ignore it, but the whispers only grew louder. And then, I heard it, a slow, deliberate knocking on my door. Knock, knock, knock. Each tap seemed to echo through the room, the sound vibrating in my chest. I froze. Who could be knocking at this hour? I hesitated, my heart racing, but finally I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it quickly, expecting to find Nate standing there, but there was no one. I stepped out into the hallway, but the hall was dark and the whispers had stopped. All that remained was the oppressive silence, a silence that felt like it was pressing in on me from every direction. I turned back to my room, but when I looked down at the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, wet, muddy prints, leading from the door to room 13. I didn't think. I just ran. I reached the end of the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There, in front of room 13, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar. My hand reached out toward it, but before I could touch the handle, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway. But I could see someone, standing in the far corner of the room. It was a figure, hunched over, its head lowered as if it were waiting for something. A voice whispered from behind me, so close to my ear it made me jump. "Leave." I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the hallway. My heart raced, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't walk away. I had to know what was in room 13. With a deep breath, I stepped into the room. It was cold, the temperature dropping as soon as I crossed the threshold. The figure in the corner remained motionless, its back turned toward me. Slowly, it began to turn around, and I was frozen in place, unable to move. When its face came into view, my stomach twisted in horror. It wasn't a person at all. It was an empty shell, a hollow, faceless figure, with nothing but smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It was the perfect image of emptiness, of something that once was but no longer existed. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest, but before I could escape, the door slammed shut behind me. The room grew darker, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from all corners. "Leave, leave, leave." The voices came from everywhere, filling my head, drowning out everything else. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't open. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming faster and faster. And then, as if on cue, the door swung open. I didn't stop to think. I ran back down the hallway, past room 12, past the lobby, and out into the night. I didn't look back. When I reached the car, Nate was already inside, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the hotel in the distance. But it was gone. The Halston Hotel, the place that had once stood like a shadow on the hill, was nowhere to be found. We never spoke of it. I never believed in ghosts. At least, not until the weekend I spent at Cedarbrook Inn. That was a place that changed my view of the supernatural forever. I'm not the type to get scared easily, but what happened to me and my friends was something I will never forget. It all started when my best friend, Emily, suggested we take a road trip to a small town upstate. She had been reading about this old hotel, Cedarbrook Inn, and thought it would be the perfect place for a weekend getaway. The reviews were mixed. Some guests claimed it was beautiful, with its Victorian charm and antique furnishings, while others spoke of strange occurrences that happened during their stays. But Emily wasn't easily deterred by ghost stories, and she was more excited about the idea of exploring an old hotel than anything else. I was hesitant, but eventually I agreed. After all, it was just a weekend trip, and what was the worst that could happen? The drive took longer than expected, and by the time we arrived, the sun had already started to set. The inn looked like something straight out of an old film, tall, with an overgrown garden and a porch that seemed to creak even in the stillness of the evening. Its dark wooden exterior was weathered, and the windows were slightly fogged up. It had an eerie charm, but at the same time, it felt like it was holding something back. A bell above the front door jingled when we walked in. The lobby was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and dust. An old chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the floors creaked under our feet as we approached the check-in desk. Behind the counter stood an older man, his back hunched and his face wrinkled with age. His eyes, though, were sharp and alert. "Welcome to Cedarbrook Inn," he said with a gruff voice. "You must be the Johnsons. Room 303, upstairs, third door on the right. Hope you enjoy your stay." We hadn't told him our names, and the way he said Johnsons made me feel uneasy. It wasn't as if he had seen our reservation. It was as if he had been expecting us. Emily and I exchanged a look, but neither of us said anything. We just grabbed the key, and the man wished us a good stay with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As we made our way upstairs, the building felt even older. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling, and the low hum of the light bulbs above us flickered intermittently. The entire hotel felt as though it hadn't seen a proper cleaning in decades, and the silence was palpable, as if we were the only ones there. When we reached our room, it was exactly how we expected it to be, old-fashioned, with a big four-poster bed and vintage furniture. The curtains were drawn tight, and the dim light from the single lamp cast long shadows on the walls. There was a strange chill in the air, even though the heating was on, and it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. "That's weird," Emily said as she dropped her suitcase onto the bed. "It's freezing in here." "I think the heating's broken," I replied, though I didn't understand why it was so cold in the first place. We didn't let it bother us too much. After all, we were there to relax, not to get freaked out. So, we went downstairs for dinner, hoping that the warmth of the restaurant would lift our spirits. When we returned later that evening, the atmosphere had shifted. The hotel felt even more oppressive, and the sounds of the night seemed to grow louder. The creaking of the floorboards, the faint sound of wind howling through the cracks in the walls. The whole place seemed to be alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I headed to the bathroom to wash up, and that's when I first noticed it. As I glanced into the mirror, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, just a flicker, a shadow darting past me. I turned around, but the room was empty. I chalked it up to my imagination and quickly finished up, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. We decided to call it a night, so I climbed into bed. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the silence of the room was shattered by a soft tapping sound. It was coming from the window. I got up and pulled the curtains open, thinking maybe it was a branch brushing against the glass. But the window was completely still. The tapping continued, growing louder, like someone was gently knocking from the outside. I pulled open the window, feeling a sudden rush of cold air, and looked out into the night. There was no one there, just the vast stretch of dark woods surrounding the hotel. I closed the window quickly, shaking my head. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The tapping continued, and every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. Emily was already asleep, her back turned to me. I tried to ignore the noise and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The tapping, the low whispers, the sound of something shifting in the walls, all of it kept me awake. In the dead of night, I woke up to a low, guttural voice. It came from somewhere in the room, though I couldn't tell where. At first, I thought it was Emily talking in her sleep, but when I looked over at her, she was still fast asleep, her face pale in the moonlight. The voice spoke again, this time clearer. "Leave this place." I froze, unable to move. I felt like something was watching me from the corner of the room. My heart pounded, and I slowly sat up in bed, trying not to make a sound. The room was pitch black, but in the darkness, I saw something. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, its outline barely visible against the shadow. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't know if I had imagined it, or if I was just too scared to move, but the sense of being watched remained. I turned to Emily, shaking her awake. "Emily, wake up," I whispered urgently. "Did you hear that?" She groggily opened her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I swear, I heard someone talking," I said, my voice trembling. She sat up and looked around the room, but of course, there was nothing there. "You're just tired. Relax." But I couldn't relax. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the noises. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the feeling of being trapped in this place, like the hotel was trying to keep us there, like it was holding something back. Something dark, something angry. The next morning, I didn't feel any better. Emily and I decided to go down to breakfast, hoping to get out of the hotel for a little while. But when we arrived in the dining room, the mood was different. It was as though the entire hotel had shifted overnight. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. There was an oppressive stillness that hung in the air, and the few other guests who were there avoided making eye contact, their faces pale and tired. We ate quickly and decided to take a walk around the property, hoping to get some fresh air. The grounds were beautiful, but even outside, the feeling of unease followed us. The trees seemed too close, the path too narrow. As we wandered deeper into the woods, Emily suddenly stopped, pointing to a small, dilapidated building hidden among the trees. "What's that?" she asked. I squinted and saw that it was an old shed, its roof caving in and the windows shattered. The entire structure seemed abandoned, forgotten. "Probably just some old storage," I said. But the closer we got, the more I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The shed was too wrong. It didn't belong there, surrounded by the trees. It felt like it was meant to be hidden away, like it was meant to be forgotten. Suddenly, the sound of tapping came again. It was louder now, more urgent, like someone was knocking on the shed from the inside. We both turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, rustling through the leaves, making the tapping seem even more real. Without saying a word, we turned and left, heading back to the hotel. But even as we packed up and checked out, I could feel something lingering behind me, watching, waiting. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hotel was still there, but in the reflection, I could see something else, something in the window. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching us leave. It wasn't until later that night, after we had arrived home, that I started to think back on the entire weekend. The strange man at the front desk, the whispers, the tapping, and most of all, the feeling that Cedarbrook Inn was alive with something dark and malevolent. I tried to tell myself it was just an old building, that the strange things we had experienced could be explained away. But as I lay in bed that night, the sound of faint tapping echoed in my ears, and I knew it wasn't over. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friend Lisa and I had been planning it for weeks, 2 days to escape the chaos of the city and retreat to the quiet countryside. We had heard about Blackwood Manor, a historic hotel nestled on the outskirts of a small town. It was known for its antique charm, stunning gardens, and, as we later found out, its mysterious past. We arrived just as the sun was setting. The hotel stood at the edge of a dense forest, its towering structure silhouetted against the fading light. The stone walls were darkened with age, and the ivy that climbed up the sides of the building made it look like something out of a Gothic novel. Despite its somewhat eerie appearance, there was a certain beauty to the place, a beauty that hinted at a time long forgotten. Inside, the lobby was just as I had imagined. Rich wood paneling, a grand staircase, and a large crystal chandelier that cast a soft glow over the room. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and polished furniture. A receptionist, a woman with silver hair and a kind face, greeted us warmly. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," she said. "I trust your trip was pleasant? We've been expecting you." Lisa and I exchanged a glance. "Expecting us?" I repeated. The woman smiled. "We've kept the best room for you, the Seton Suite. It's on the 3rd floor, at the end of the hallway. You'll find it most comfortable." I was a little taken aback by how easily she knew our names, but I didn't let it bother me. She handed us an old-fashioned brass key, the kind you don't see much anymore, and we made our way up to our room. The 3rd floor was quieter than the rest of the hotel, as if it existed in its own little world. The hallway was dimly lit, and the old carpets beneath our feet felt soft and worn. The air had that musty quality that only old buildings have, partly damp, partly stale, with a strange heaviness that made the place feel like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The door to the Seton Suite was at the very end of the hall, a large wooden door with a brass nameplate engraved with the words Seton Suite. When we entered, I was immediately struck by the room's grandeur. It was a massive space with high ceilings, large windows draped in thick velvet curtains, and antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But there was something off about it. The air was thick, as if it had been trapped inside for years. The walls were adorned with portraits, old, faded portraits of stern-faced men and women who stared down at us from their frames. Their eyes seemed to follow us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching our every move. Lisa seemed to like it, though. She started unpacking her bag, humming softly as she explored the room. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I kept glancing at the door, wondering if I had heard a faint whisper from the hallway, but when I checked, there was no one there. We decided to explore the hotel before it got too late. After all, it was a historic building, and we were curious to see what secrets it might hold. As we wandered through the lower floors, I couldn't help but notice how deserted the hotel seemed. There were no other guests, just the soft echo of our footsteps in the empty halls. It was as if we were the only ones there. Eventually, we found ourselves in the hotel's library, a grand room lined with shelves of old books and leather chairs. We sat down in front of the fireplace, chatting about nothing in particular. But then, as the night grew darker, a strange feeling settled over me. The quiet seemed heavier now, almost suffocating, and I had the distinct impression that someone, or something, was in the room with us. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, growing stronger as time passed. I glanced at Lisa, but she was absorbed in a book, her back to me. I couldn't help but look around the room again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the far wall, as if something was walking just out of my line of sight. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the shadow moved again, this time more clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the room with us. I stood up abruptly, causing Lisa to glance over at me with a surprised look. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I thought I saw something," I replied, my voice shaking. "I swear there's something moving in here." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're scaring yourself, that's all. It's just a dark room, and you've been reading too many ghost stories." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to sound crazy. So, I nodded and sat back down. But the unease didn't leave me. It stayed with me, creeping under my skin, whispering in the back of my mind. I couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard I tried. After a while, we decided to call it a night and headed back to the Seton suite. The hallway was even quieter now, if that was possible. I couldn't help but feel like the hotel itself was watching us, waiting for something. When we reached the room, I immediately went to bed, trying to put my thoughts out of my mind. But sleep didn't come easily. The bed was too big, too empty, and the room felt colder than it should have been. I pulled the blankets tightly around myself, but it didn't help. I woke up at what felt like the dead of night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, echoing down the long corridor. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining my ears to listen. But the footsteps didn't come closer. They just stopped. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, but nothing happened. No one knocked on the door, no one called out. The silence returned, as thick and heavy as ever. I glanced over at Lisa, who was still fast asleep, undisturbed by the noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something here, something hidden, something that didn't want to be found. The next morning, I tried to shake off my unease. Lisa was chipper as usual, but I couldn't help but feel like something was lurking just beneath the surface of the hotel, watching, waiting. After breakfast, we decided to explore the grounds, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. We wandered through the gardens, which were beautiful but overgrown, the flowers wild and untended. The atmosphere was heavy, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. Everything felt off. The trees swayed slightly, but there was no wind. The birds were silent. The entire garden felt frozen in time. That's when we saw the door. It was hidden behind a thick veil of ivy at the back of the garden, a small, weathered door that seemed to lead nowhere. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong. We approached it cautiously, unsure of what to make of it. "What do you think this is?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing, "but something about it feels wrong." The door was locked, but as we stood there, staring at it, I felt the distinct sense that we weren't alone. It was as if the door was calling us, urging us to open it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind it, whatever had been hidden there for so long, wasn't meant to be discovered. Before I could say anything, the door creaked open slightly, as if by itself. I froze. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Lisa nodded, her face pale. It opened. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to leave the hotel, and never looked back. But another part of me, some dark curiosity, wanted to know what was behind that door. I reached out slowly, and just as my fingers touched the handle, a voice, soft and barely audible, whispered in my ear, "Don't." I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't Lisa. It was something else. We both backed away from the door, and as we turned to leave, I glanced back. The door was closed once more, hidden behind the thick vines. That night, we decided it was time to leave. Something about Blackwood Manor, its oppressive silence, its haunting atmosphere, was too much for us. We packed our bags and made our way downstairs, but the lobby was empty. The receptionist was nowhere to be found, and the front doors were locked. I felt a chill run down my spine. The hotel seemed different now, darker, more alive, as though it was trapping us inside. We tried to leave through the back door, but it, too, was locked. The windows wouldn't budge. We were trapped. And then, from somewhere deep in the hotel, we heard it, a soft, echoing voice, clear and cold. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The room went cold as the voice faded away. That was the moment I knew we had disturbed something that was never meant to be found. We left Blackwood Manor that night, and I never looked back. But sometimes when it was meant to be a quick stop, just a place to rest for the night as I made my way across the state. But that stop ended up being one I would never forget. I still think about it, even years later, and I wonder if I ever really left the Edgewater Hotel at all. I had been driving for hours, and it was already well past midnight when I spotted the hotel sign. The Edgewater Hotel was an old building, faded and weathered by time. It stood at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by thick trees and a small, murky lake. I had never seen anything like it before. A grand, old structure with a turret rising high above the others. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. I had no intention of staying in such an old, run-down place, but after a long day on the road and the only other motels in the area looking far too sketchy for my taste, I figured I'd give it a shot. How bad could it be? As I entered the hotel, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not a single sound. No chatter, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the old chandelier above the lobby. The front desk was empty, but I rang the bell, and a moment later, a man appeared from behind a door. He had a thin face, his skin pale and wrinkled, his eyes shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Good evening," he said, his voice gravelly but polite. "Can I help you?" I explained that I was looking for a room, and he didn't hesitate. He handed me a brass key with a number 207 stamped on it. "Room 207. It's a bit out of the way, but it's quiet," he said with a strange smile. I didn't think much of it at the time. I took the key and thanked him before heading upstairs. The stairs creaked under my feet as I ascended, and the dim light in the hallway made the wallpaper look like it was rotting. It was a classic old hotel vibe, both charming and eerie at once. When I reached room 207, I inserted the key into the lock, expecting a worn-out room, maybe a little musty, but nothing out of the ordinary. What I didn't expect was the overwhelming chill that hit me when I stepped inside. The room itself was large and spacious, though it had a strange, gloomy atmosphere. The furniture was all old, antique, even, but not in a nostalgic way. It was as if it had been left to decay for years. The bed was large, draped in heavy, dark red curtains, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges, showing cracks in the walls underneath. The dim lighting from the single lamp barely illuminated the space, and there was a strange smell, like old books and damp wood. I unpacked my things and sat on the bed, trying to relax after a long day of driving. But something was off. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner of the room, but there was nothing there, just the quiet. After a while, I decided to call it a night and lay down. But as I closed my eyes, I heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint at first, like the distant sound of someone murmuring, but it quickly grew louder. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. The whisper seemed to be coming from the walls. It wasn't in a language I recognized. It sounded like a jumble of words, a mix of soft voices, all speaking at once. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just the building settling. But as I lay back down, the whispers continued. They were louder now, as though the walls themselves were speaking, and they were closer, almost right next to me. "Get out." The voice was clearer this time, and it sent a chill through my body. It was a woman's voice, but it was raspy, as if she had been whispering for a long time. I jumped out of bed, looking around the room, trying to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing, no one there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the air in the room grow colder. The whispering was still there, but now it seemed to be coming from the other side of the room. The walls were vibrating, as though something was trying to break through them. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. The phone rang a few times before the same gravelly voice answered. "Edgewater Hotel, how may I assist you?" There's something going on in my room. I keep hearing voices, whispers," I said, my voice shaky. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he responded. "Room 207, you say?" "Yes, that's right," I replied, not sure if I was hearing him correctly. "I suggest you don't stay in that room for long," the man said, his voice suddenly cold. It's been cursed." Before I could respond, he hung up. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the receiver in my hand, my mind racing. Cursed? What did he mean? But then the whispering started again, louder this time, almost frantic. "Get out. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the room, down the hall, and back toward the stairs. As I descended, I heard the whispers follow me, echoing off the walls, getting louder with every step. "Leave, leave, leave," it chanted, and it sounded like there was more than one voice now, each one overlapping the other. When I reached the lobby, I saw the man behind the desk again. His pale face was lit by the dim light, and he looked at me with a strange, almost knowing expression. "I told you about room 207, he said softly. "You should have listened." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, trying to calm my breath. "Is there somewhere else I can stay?" I asked, my voice strained. The man didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "There's another room on the first floor, room 102. It's empty." I didn't ask any more questions. I just took the key he handed me and walked away, my legs trembling. But as I passed the hall where room 207 was, I glanced down the corridor, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving in the doorway. It was quick, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I reached room 102 and locked the door behind me. As soon as I stepped inside, the whispers stopped. The room was quiet again, and I could finally breathe. I turned on all the lights, checked under the bed, and even checked the closet, just to be sure. But there was nothing but the silence of the old hotel, and the feeling that something was watching me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I didn't fully understand. The next morning, I checked out early, and when I went to pay at the front desk, the man was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The lobby was empty, and the hotel felt even quieter than before, as if the building itself had swallowed him whole. I left the Edgewater Hotel behind me, but I still think about it often. I've driven by that same stretch of road a few times since, and I swear I've seen the hotel in the distance. But every time I get closer, it seems to disappear, as if the place is just a mirage. There are nights, though, when I hear the whispers again, soft, distant voices calling me to come back, and I wonder, what was it that really haunted room 207? What did I narrowly avoid? I don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. Some things are better left unanswered. I had always been the type of person who enjoyed history, especially when it came to old, charming places like hotels. My friends often thought I was strange for staying in places that seemed to have a little too much character for comfort, but I loved the stories that came with them. The stories of times long gone, of past guests, and the kind of mysterious energy that only old places seem to have. But what happened to me at the Holloway Inn, an ancient hotel tucked away in the middle of nowhere, made me reconsider my love for these kinds of places forever. It was a cold autumn evening when I pulled into the Holloway Inn. I had been driving for hours and was completely exhausted. The sun was just setting behind the tall trees surrounding the hotel, casting long shadows across the cracked, cobblestone driveway. The inn itself looked exactly like something out of a Gothic novel, an old, three-story building made of stone, its windows darkened by the night, and the iron gate at the entrance creaking ominously in the wind. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which I thought was odd for a hotel of this size. But the place seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, so I brushed it off as a matter of timing. As I stepped out of my car and made my way toward the front entrance, I noticed a peculiar scent in the air, like wet wood and old fabric. A musty, almost moldy smell that made the back of my throat itch. But I was too tired to care. I needed sleep. The lobby inside was dimly lit, with an antique chandelier hanging from the ceiling, its crystals slightly tarnished. A long, plush carpet covered the floor, its red pattern faded from years of foot traffic. On the reception desk sat an old brass bell, and beside it was a worn-out guest book. I rang the bell, and after a few moments, an elderly man appeared behind the counter. His thin white hair matched his pale, wrinkled skin, and his eyes were sharp, though his expression remained neutral. He was wearing an old-fashioned bellboy uniform, complete with a brass name tag that read Mr. Whitmore. "Good evening," he said in a soft, gravelly voice. "Checking in?" I nodded, explaining that I needed a room for the night. He didn't seem surprised by my late arrival, which struck me as odd. In fact, he didn't seem surprised by much at all, as if this was an ordinary night for him. Without asking for any identification or payment up front, he handed me an old-fashioned iron key with a number 3 etched into the tag. "Room 3, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's on the second floor. I'll take you up." I followed him up the creaky staircase, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, and I noticed that the walls were covered in dark wallpaper that had begun to peel at the edges, revealing faded, yellowing plaster beneath. The atmosphere in the hallway was heavy, as if the air had become thick with time itself. As we reached the second floor, Mr. Whitmore turned to me with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Here we are," he said, stopping in front of a door that had a dark mahogany frame. He unlocked it with a key and pushed it open. The room was small but cozy, with an antique bed draped in an old, quilted coverlet. The furniture was heavy, made of dark oak, and the windows were shut tight, their curtains drawn. "Everything you need is here," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice still soft but strangely soothing. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to call." I thanked him, feeling an odd sense of unease, and watched as he left, closing the door behind him. Once I was alone in the room, I sat on the bed and exhaled a long breath. The place was far more aged than I had expected, but it was quiet and private. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. As I began to unpack, I heard a faint sound, a rustling coming from the corner of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was there. I turned quickly, scanning the room for anything that could explain the noise, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to the building settling. Old buildings often make strange noises, especially ones this old. I settled into the bed after a while, the quiet of the room swallowing any other thoughts I had. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard the sound again. This time, it was clearer. The soft rustling, like something moving across the floor. I sat up in bed, looking around the room in confusion. I didn't see anything, but the room felt different. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and I noticed the shadows seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally along the walls. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around me. I was tired and just wanted to sleep. But then, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, like a whisper, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft and almost pleading. "Help me," it said. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely someone in the room with me. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. I got out of bed quickly, my pulse racing. I grabbed my phone, thinking I would call the front desk, but as I dialed the number, I noticed something strange. The phone screen flickered, and the call wouldn't go through. I tried several more times, but the same thing happened. My connection kept dropping. I was starting to feel panicked when I heard a soft knock on the door. It was gentle, almost like a soft tap, but it made my stomach turn. I hesitated before walking toward the door. I was almost too afraid to open it, but I couldn't just ignore it either. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door. To my surprise, there was no one there. But there was something strange, something I hadn't noticed before. A faint trail of wet footprints led from the hallway into the room. They were small, like the footprints of a child, and they glistened with moisture, as if they had just stepped through water. The air felt colder now, and I realized that the room had grown uncomfortably cold, a coldness that settled deep in my bones. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all, but the only thing I could see was the reflection in the mirror above the dresser. For a split second, I saw something in that mirror. A figure. It was a woman, her face pale and twisted in pain. She looked like she was reaching out for help, but no sound escaped her lips. I gasped, stumbling back from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I spun around, but the room was empty. The footsteps, the whispers, they were real, and I had no idea what was going on. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, nearly tripping down the stairs. When I reached the lobby, Mr. Whitmore was sitting in a chair by the fire, his eyes closed. He didn't look up as I entered. "Are you leaving?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. I nodded, feeling a chill settle in my chest. I needed to leave now. "I can't stay in that room," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something in there. Something wrong." Mr. Whitmore finally opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze sharp and unblinking. "You should have known better," he said quietly. "Room 3 has been empty for years. No one stays there anymore." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The woman who died there. She never left," he replied. "She's still looking for help." I didn't stay to hear the rest of his story. I just grabbed my bags and ran out into the night, not looking back. As I left the hallway in behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had left that night. I don't know what happened to the woman in room 3, but something told me that she wasn't done yet. I've driven past the hallway several times since, and each time I do, I can't help but wonder if the hotel is still standing. If it is, I'm certain that room 3 is still waiting for its next guest. But I'll never go back. Some things are better left alone, and some ghosts are better left undisturbed. I've always been a sucker for old hotels. There's something captivating about their faded grandeur, their creaking floors, and their dusty chandeliers. Every old hotel has a story to tell, and I'm the type of person who's always eager to listen. Little did I know, my stay at the Marlowe Hotel would turn out to be a story I'll never forget. A story I still can't quite explain, and one that still haunts me. It started on a rainy afternoon, right in the middle of a solo road trip I was taking across the country. I was driving through a small, sleepy town when I saw the Marlowe Hotel sign, barely visible through the downpour. The hotel looked ancient, 3 stories of brick and iron, with ivy creeping up its walls. The windows were dark, but there was something about the place that made me want to stop. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the promise of a good night's sleep, but I pulled my car into the small parking lot without giving it a second thought. The lobby of the hotel was just as old as the outside, dimly lit with a large, ornate chandelier hanging above, casting shadows on the worn carpets below. The front desk was manned by an elderly woman with a severe bun and a pair of thick spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up as I entered and gave me a thin, polite smile. "Welcome to the Marlowe Hotel," she said, her voice dry as dust. "How may I help you?" I asked for a room, and she gave me a key to a room on the second floor, room 214. It was an old-fashioned brass key, tarnished from years of use. As I took it from her, I couldn't help but notice that her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and there was something unsettling about the way she looked at me, like she knew something I didn't. "Enjoy your stay," she said quietly, almost as if warning me. I didn't think much of it at the time, After all, I was just tired and ready to rest. I made my way upstairs, the old wood creaking beneath my feet as I walked down the long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people who had long since faded from memory. The air smelled like dust and old perfume, a combination that made me feel like I was stepping into another era. Room 214 was at the end of the hall. When I opened the door, I was hit by a strange chill. The room was cozy enough, small but functional, with an old iron bed frame, a faded quilt, and a small writing desk near the window. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the carpet was threadbare, but it had a certain charm. I dropped my bag on the bed and went to close the window, which was slightly ajar, letting in the damp, cold air. As I stood there, gazing out at the rain, I felt something strange, a cold breeze, even though the window was barely open. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the rain hitting the windowsill. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and went to take a quick shower. When I got out and returned to the room, I noticed something odd. The bed, which I had left undisturbed, now had a small indentation in the middle of it, as if someone had been sitting there. I frowned, wondering if I had forgotten to smooth out the blankets when I left. But I knew I hadn't touched the bed. Feeling unsettled, I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop to pass the time. The sound of the rain outside began to grow louder, almost as if it were intensifying, and I found myself glancing nervously at the door and the window. The hotel felt so quiet, so empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. An oppressive sense of being watched, maybe, but I started to feel like something was lurking just beyond my vision. It wasn't until I heard the first noise that I realized how wrong things were. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against wood, came from somewhere in the room. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but then it happened again, closer this time. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. My heart began to race, and I turned toward the sound, convinced someone was in the room with me. But there was nothing. No one. I got up, trembling, and checked the closet, under the bed, and behind the curtains. Everything was as it should be, but the scratching continued, now coming from the walls. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone was trying to claw their way through the plaster. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I wasn't sure if I should stay or leave, but as I stood there, frozen in fear, the scratching stopped. The room fell back into silence, and I thought maybe I was just imagining things. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the window, standing behind me, was a shadow. It was tall and thin, and at first, I thought it was just the reflection of the rain-soaked trees outside. But no, this shadow was different. It was a figure, dark and vaguely human, with long, outstretched arms. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. I was alone in the room. I stood up again, feeling dizzy, and rushed to the door. I needed to get out, needed to get away from whatever was in that room with me. But when I reached for the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, even though I hadn't touched it. My panic set in, and I started banging on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, clearer. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, soft and pained. I could hear the desperation in her tone, the way she was pleading. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time closer, almost as if it was right behind me. I spun around, but once again, there was nothing there. Just the empty, cold room. That's when I remembered what the elderly woman at the front desk had said. Room 214. It's been vacant for a reason. I couldn't remember the exact words, but now I understood. Whatever was in that room wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something real, something that had been trapped in that space for years. Desperate to escape, I rushed to the window and tried to pry it open, but it was stuck. The voice was getting louder now, and the scratching had returned, louder than ever. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in the room with something I couldn't see but could certainly feel. And then, as if the room itself had a life of its own, the door suddenly swung open with a loud creak. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the hallway, past the faded portraits, past the old chandelier, and down the stairs. When I reached the lobby, the elderly woman was sitting at the desk, as if nothing had happened. "Leaving already?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the newspaper in her hands. I nodded frantically. "I'm done. I can't stay here." She looked up at me then, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You weren't supposed to be in room 214, she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "No one ever is." I didn't ask any more questions. I grabbed my things and fled into the rain, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I drove away from the Marlowe Hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that whatever had been in that room wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't shake the sound of that voice, the scraping of nails against the walls, and the shadow I had seen in the reflection. To this day, I have never gone back to that hotel, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are meant to be forgotten, and some ghosts are better left undisturbed. But the Marlowe Hotel still lingers in my mind, and every time I pass through that small town, I can't help but glance at the building in the distance, wondering if anyone else will ever check into room 214, and if they do, I hope they leave before it's too late. I've always been fascinated by old buildings, especially hotels. There's something eerie and enchanting about them, as though the walls hold stories of people long gone, secrets that have been buried in time. That's how I ended up at the Silver Pines Hotel, a place that looked like it had been frozen in time. I had been driving all day, looking for a quiet place to rest, and the Silver Pines, with its old-world charm, seemed like the perfect stop. Little did I know, my stay would be anything but peaceful. It was just past dusk when I pulled up to the hotel. The Silver Pines was a small, three-story building located at the edge of a quiet, forested town. The faded sign above the entrance still promised warm hospitality and old-fashioned comfort, but there was an unsettling feeling about the place, an unexplainable heaviness in the air. The building itself had an old-world charm, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and antique lanterns flanking the front door. But the windows, though large, were dark, almost as if the hotel had been abandoned for years. I hesitated for a moment, but the day's fatigue pushed me forward. I was tired, and I didn't want to continue driving in the dark. As I stepped inside, I was immediately greeted by a faint, musty smell that seemed to permeate the very air. The lobby was dimly lit by a few antique chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. The walls were adorned with portraits of past hotel owners and long-forgotten guests, their faces frozen in time. The check-in desk was manned by a young man, probably in his early 20s, with messy hair and a tired look in his eyes. "Evening," he said with a yawn as I approached the desk. "How can I help you?" I explained that I needed a room for the night. He smiled and handed me a brass key with the number 304 etched on it. I took the key and asked, "Is the hotel full tonight?" He shrugged. "It's just you tonight, actually. The place doesn't get much business these days." I couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable with the mention of how empty the hotel was, but I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a small, rural place. I thanked him and made my way to the elevator. As the doors closed and the elevator began to rise, I could hear the faint sound of creaking, like the building itself was alive. When I reached the third floor, the hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The air was colder here, and the silence felt almost oppressive. The floorboards creaked under my footsteps as I walked toward room 304. When I opened the door, the room was just as I had expected: old-fashioned furniture, a four-poster bed with dark velvet curtains, and a small writing desk near the window. The wallpaper was faded, and the carpet was threadbare, but there was a certain charm to it all. I set my bag down and made myself comfortable. The hotel seemed quiet, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. It was probably just the isolation of being in such an old, remote place. After a quick dinner, I decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, the clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing through the silence. I had just begun to drift off to sleep when I heard something, a soft tapping noise, almost like a knock at the door. I sat up, heart pounding. I wasn't expecting any visitors. I glanced at the door, my mind racing. It was probably just the wind, or maybe the hotel's old structure settling. I waited for a moment, but when the knocking continued, faint but steady, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I hesitated for a moment, then got up and made my way to the door. When I opened it, there was no one in the hallway, just the dim light from the flickering overhead lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. I looked up and down the hallway, but there was no sign of anyone. Confused and a little unnerved, I closed the door and locked it. The knocking had stopped, but now I was wide awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I was being watched. I tried to push the thought out of my mind and went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room grew colder, the air thick with an uncomfortable chill. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it didn't help. I felt restless, like something was lurking in the shadows just beyond my reach. The tick of the clock seemed louder now, echoing in the silence. Suddenly, I heard it again, the soft knock, this time coming from inside the room. It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart raced, and I sat up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. I turned toward the sound and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light, a figure stood at the foot of the bed. It was a woman, her face pale, her hair long and unkempt. She wore a tattered white gown, and her eyes were hollow, empty, as if she had seen things no one should ever see. She stood there silently, staring at me, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. I froze, unable to move or even scream. The figure slowly began to move closer, her feet gliding across the floor as if she were floating. The room grew even colder, and the air felt heavy, as if it were thick with something dark and oppressive. I could hear her breath, soft, shallow, like someone who had been trapped for far too long. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly raised one bony hand and pointed toward the window, her finger trembling. I followed her gaze, but the window was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Nothing was there, but when I turned back to the woman, she was gone. Just like that, vanished, as if she had never been there at all. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed to the door, threw it open, and ran down the hallway. But when I reached the elevator, I found it was out of service. Panic began to set in as I ran up the stairs, back to the lobby, but the hotel seemed endless. The long hallways stretched on and on, as if the hotel itself were changing shape, growing longer, more labyrinthine. Finally, I made it back to the front desk. The young man who had checked me in was still there, but now he looked different, paler, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked up at me with a strange expression, like he knew exactly what I had seen. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I could barely speak. "Who was that woman?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He sighed, his gaze turning distant. "Her name was Evelyn. She was one of the hotel's first guests, back in the 1920s. She died here, in room 304, under mysterious circumstances. No one really knows what happened, but some say she was trapped here, lost in the building's dark past. Is she still here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The young man nodded slowly. "She's never left. The hotel holds her, keeps her trapped in the walls. And if you stay long enough, she'll find you. She always does." I couldn't bear to hear any more. Without another word, I ran out of the hotel, into the cold night air. The rain was coming down harder now, but it felt like a relief, like I was washing away the weight of the experience. As I looked back at the Silver Pines Hotel, I saw her again. Just for a moment, a shadowy figure standing in one of the windows, watching me. I've never returned to that hotel, and I never will. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howls and the rain falls, I can still feel her eyes on me, watching from the darkness. And I know that the Silver Pines Hotel is waiting for its next guest to fall victim to the spirit of Evelyn, who will never rest. Some hotels are more than just buildings. Some are prisons for souls, trapped by the past, unable to escape. And the Silver Pines Hotel is one of them. There's something about old hotels that makes them feel different, something that can't quite be put into words. Maybe it's the creaking floors, or the way the rooms smell like dust and forgotten memories. Maybe it's the whispers in the walls, or the faint echo of footsteps when no one's around. But for me, it wasn't just the atmosphere of an old hotel that made my skin crawl. It was the encounter that changed everything for me. It happened last fall when I was traveling across the country, looking for inspiration for a book I was writing. I'd stayed in a lot of hotels over the years, most of them nondescript, but something about the name the Hollowbrook Inn intrigued me. The hotel was located in a small town, tucked away in a corner of nowhere. The town itself felt like it hadn't changed in decades, the streets empty and the buildings worn down by time. But when I pulled up to the Hollowbrook Inn, it seemed strangely welcoming, with its warm, amber lights glowing through the windows and the faint sound of a piano playing from somewhere inside. I didn't think much of it when I walked in, other than the fact that the lobby was exactly how I imagined an old, forgotten hotel would look. Chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, dark wood paneling, and a wide staircase that seemed to go on forever. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, like the wood and walls had absorbed years of history and memories. At the front desk, there was a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses who looked up from a newspaper when I approached. "Good evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "You here for the night?" "Yeah," I said, "just for one. It's been a long drive." He smiled faintly. "Room 212. It's upstairs, second door on the left. Key's right here." He handed me an old brass key, its number 212 etched into it, and pointed toward the stairs. "Thank you," I said, trying to ignore the unease bubbling in my chest. There was something about the way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't, but I couldn't place it. I took the key and headed up the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath my feet as I climbed. The second floor was quieter than the first, with long hallways that stretched out into darkness. As I walked down the narrow corridor toward room 212, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air became thick with an almost suffocating heaviness. Room 212 wasn't much different from what I expected. A small, simple room with a bed covered in an old, faded quilt, a worn armchair in the corner, and a dresser with a mirror hanging above it. The room itself felt like it hadn't been updated in decades, the wallpaper peeling in places, the carpet stained and frayed. Still, I was too tired to care and figured I'd get a good night's sleep. As I unpacked my bag and settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the room. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, like there was someone, watching me. I shrugged it off, though. I was just overtired from the long drive, and I needed some rest. After a while, I turned off the light and crawled into bed, the coldness of the sheets sending a shiver down my spine. But the discomfort didn't stop there. As I lay in the dark, trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint noise, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then the whisper came again. It was too clear to be just the wind, too distinct to be my imagination. "Help me." The voice was soft, a woman's voice. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, my ears straining to hear it again. But the room was completely still now. I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning and the sound of traffic from outside, but nothing else. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a dream, maybe the remnants of a nightmare still lingering in my mind. But then, the whisper came again, this time louder and more urgent. "Help me, please." I froze. The voice sounded so real, so close, as if it were right next to me. But when I looked around the room, there was no one there. The only movement was the faint rustling of the curtains as a breeze blew through the window. I turned on the light and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was running wild, trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a neighbor, or perhaps the hotel had thin walls. But deep down, I knew something was off. I got up and went to the door, opening it cautiously to check the hallway. It was empty, the faint sound of the piano from downstairs the only noise I could hear. The hallway was dark and silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just out of sight, waiting. I stepped back into the room, locking the door behind me. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't feel safe. I looked around again, my eyes landing on the old mirror above the dresser. For a brief second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, a shadow shifting in the corner of the room. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself it was just the stress of traveling, the fatigue, the unfamiliarity of the hotel. But when I climbed back into bed, I could still hear the faint whispering, soft as a breath on the wind. "Help me. I'm still here." I pulled the blanket over my head, but sleep refused to come. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. And then, suddenly, I heard a noise, louder this time, more distinct. The sound of footsteps. I sat up, heart racing. The footsteps came from the hallway, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking just outside my door. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and crept to the door. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps continued, growing closer, until they stopped right outside my room. I didn't dare open the door, too terrified to move. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the door handle jiggled. I backed away slowly, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I could hear the handle turning, the sound of someone, or something, pushing against the door. But I didn't dare make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the handle stopped moving. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful silence I was used to. It was thick, heavy, and filled with something I couldn't identify, something sinister. I crept back to the bed, my mind spinning. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. "Leave now." The voice was louder now, closer. I could feel it in my bones, like the voice was inside my head. And then, all at once, the room grew even colder, and the lights flickered. The mirror above the dresser cracked, the sharp sound echoing through the room. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my bag, rushed to the door, and yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but I didn't care. I ran down the stairs and straight to the front desk. The man behind the desk was still there, his face pale, his eyes wide with something. Recognition? He looked at me, almost knowingly, like he had been expecting me to come down in a panic. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. I nodded, too terrified to speak. "You need to leave," he said quickly, his hands shaking. "Room 212, it's cursed. There's a reason it's been empty for so long. There's a spirit trapped there, a woman who died under terrible circumstances. She won't let anyone stay in that room for long." I didn't need to hear more. I grabbed my things and ran out into the night, the hotel looming behind me like a dark, ominous figure. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and swore I saw something standing in the window of room 212, something pale, its eyes dark and hollow, watching me as I drove away. I never stayed at the Hollowbrook Inn again, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the soft whispers, and the coldness of room 212. Some hotels hold more than just memories. They hold spirits trapped in time, waiting for someone to take their place. And the Hollowbrook Inn is one of those places. It was the dead of winter when I decided to take a road trip across the state. I had been meaning to get away for a while, away from the constant hustle of everyday life, away from the noise of the city. I was tired of everything and everyone. A quiet weekend getaway in a small town seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I had no particular destination in mind, just driving and hoping for the best. Eventually, I came across a town called Elmsbury, a place I'd never heard of before. The town seemed to be stuck in time, as if nothing had changed in decades. Its old brick buildings, narrow streets, and faded storefronts gave it an almost eerie charm. As I drove through, I noticed a large, old hotel near the center of town. The sign read the Bellevue Hotel, and it looked like it hadn't been updated in years. Its windows were dark, but the lobby lights were on, casting a warm glow onto the snow-covered sidewalks. Curious, I parked my car and went inside. The lobby smelled like old leather and dust, a typical scent in old buildings. Behind the front desk was a woman, probably in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked up from her newspaper and gave me a warm smile. "Welcome to the Bellevue," she said, her voice thick with a southern drawl. "Looking for a room?" "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, tired from hours of driving. "How much for a single?" She tapped away at the old register, her fingers moving slowly, as if each key was a small effort. "Room 306, she said, handing me a heavy brass key. "It's just upstairs, third door on the left." I thanked her and took the key, noting how thick the air felt in the lobby. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like the building was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I figured I was just overtired and in need of rest. The elevator was small, old, and creaky, its brass doors gleaming in the dim light. As I ascended to the third floor, the elevator groaned as it moved, and the soft flickering of the overhead light added to the sense of unease I felt. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a long, narrow hallway. The carpet was worn, the walls lined with old, faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. The whole floor smelled like mothballs and something else, something faintly metallic. I walked down the hall, the only sound being the faint thud of my boots on the worn carpet. When I reached room 306, I hesitated for a moment. The door was made of heavy wood, its paint chipped and faded. A small plaque with the number 306 hung crookedly on the doorframe. I inserted the key into the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing the room inside. It was a typical old hotel room, with a large bed covered in a floral pattern quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a small desk by the window. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the curtains were drawn, casting the room in a dim, grayish light. I set my bags down and immediately went to the window to look outside, hoping the view would calm my nerves. The hotel was situated on a quiet street, with a few scattered buildings and houses in the distance. The streetlights cast long shadows, and I could see the outlines of trees swaying in the wind. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. I turned around to start unpacking when I noticed something odd. The mirror above the dresser was foggy, even though the room was cold, and the window hadn't been open long enough to cause condensation. As I stared at it, I thought I saw a movement in the glass, something shifting in the reflection just out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I quickly turned away from the mirror and began unpacking my things. I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, but the sense of unease lingered. Later that evening, after a small dinner at a local diner, I returned to my room and settled in for the night. I turned off the lights and lay in bed, my mind racing as I tried to fall asleep. The silence in the hotel was deafening. I couldn't hear anything outside my room, nothing at all. No cars passing by, no voices in the halls, just the faint hum of the old building. Around midnight, I woke with a start. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, from down the hallway, I heard a soft sound, a faint whispering, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I froze, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, but it was still so soft, so indistinct, that I couldn't make out any words. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The whispering seemed to come from all around me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. Then, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed from the hallway outside my door. The sound of boots scraping against the wooden floor. I held my breath, trying to make out where they were coming from. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I leapt out of bed and rushed to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I flung it open, hoping to find someone, anyone, just to reassure myself. But the hallway was empty. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. Nothing was out of place. Confused and a little scared, I stepped back into the room and locked the door behind me. But as soon as I turned around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror above the dresser, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were dark, hollow, and fixed directly on me. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. I rushed to the mirror, my heart racing, but the reflection was normal again. The man was gone. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. There was no way anyone had been in the room. I hadn't heard anyone enter, and the door was locked. But the image was so vivid, so real, that it felt as though the man had been right there beside me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the night wore on, I kept hearing the faint whispers again, growing louder and more frantic, as if someone, or something, was calling out for help. When morning finally came, I didn't wait around to find out what else the Bellevue Hotel had in store for me. I packed my things in a hurry, barely taking the time to check out at the front desk. The woman who had greeted me when I first arrived wasn't there, and I didn't feel the need to stay longer than necessary. As I left the hotel, I took one last look at the building. I could have sworn I saw a shadow pass by the top window, a dark shape moving behind the curtains, but when I blinked, it was gone. I've never been back to Elmsbury, and I never will. The Bellevue Hotel is a place I will never forget, a place where the past seems to linger just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. Some places are better left untouched, and some spirits are never meant to rest. It was the kind of place you only find when you're trying to escape the noise and chaos of the world. A quiet, old town tucked away in the mountains and hidden within it. An even older hotel, the Drake House. I had never heard of the place before, but I had been driving for hours and was desperate for a place to stay. The hotel seemed like a relic of another time, with ivy crawling up its brick walls and a large sign that seemed to be made of brass but had long since dulled with age. But it was just the kind of atmosphere I was craving, isolated and peaceful. When I pulled up to the front, the hotel looked like it belonged in a horror movie, old-fashioned, dark, and mysterious. But that was the allure, wasn't it? I figured I'd take a quick rest, grab a few hours of sleep, and continue my road trip the next morning. I stepped out of my car and made my way to the entrance, feeling a slight chill in the air. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the lobby. The lobby was dimly lit, but there was a certain charm to the place, with its old wooden furniture and patterned rugs on the floor. It smelled of wood polish and something faintly sweet, like a mixture of lavender and old books. Behind the front desk sat a man in his late 50s or early 60s, his face weathered and tired-looking. He glanced up as I entered, and I could see his eyes were small, as if he'd been awake for far too long. "Good evening," he said in a low voice, his accent thick but gentle. "How can I help you? I was wondering if you had any rooms available?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. The man seemed to consider my question for a moment before nodding slowly. "We have a room. It's on the second floor. Room 208. I took the key he handed me, noticing how heavy it was. The brass tag attached to it gleamed in the dim light of the lobby. I thanked the man and made my way up to the second floor. The staircase creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, the sound echoing in the silent building. The hallway on the second floor was long and narrow, with worn-out carpet and wallpaper that had started to peel. The only light came from old sconces mounted on the walls, their weak bulbs casting a faint yellow glow. I walked past a few rooms, noting how quiet it was, and then reached room 208. The door to room 208 opened with an unsettling groan, as if the building itself was reluctant to let anyone inside. The room was small but cozy, an antique bed covered with a faded quilt, a small dresser, and a worn armchair by the window. The window was cracked slightly, allowing a cool breeze to drift through the room. It felt like I had stepped into the past, a time long gone. I dropped my bags on the bed and took a deep breath, ready to relax. I was tired from the long drive and needed rest before continuing my journey the next day. As I unpacked, I noticed a framed photograph on the bedside table. It was an old black and white photo, probably taken in the 1920s or 1930s, showing a young couple smiling at the camera in front of what appeared to be the very same hotel. They looked happy, but there was something strange about the photo. The man's eyes seemed unusually dark, almost hollow. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just a photo, after all, nothing to worry about. I turned off the lights, pulled the covers over me, and tried to settle in. The quiet of the room was comforting, and I felt myself drifting off to sleep, the peaceful stillness wrapping around me like a blanket. But just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard something, a faint knock on the door. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I was just too tired. But then I heard it again. 3 distinct knocks, like someone was standing outside my room. I sat up in bed, my heart beating faster. I waited for a moment, wondering if someone had made a mistake and knocked on the wrong door. But after a few seconds, the knocking came again. This time more urgent, as if someone was trying to get my attention. Hesitant, I slowly walked over to the door, my mind racing with thoughts of who could be on the other side. I didn't hear any voices, just the sound of the knocks. I looked through the peephole, but I saw nothing. No one was there. Confused, I opened the door, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway. But once again, there was no one. The hallway was empty and silent. I closed the door and locked it, but the unease settled over me like a heavy weight. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I got back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room felt colder now, and the silence seemed oppressive, as if something was waiting in the shadows. Around midnight, I was awoken by a sound. A soft, scraping noise coming from the corner of the room. It was subtle, like the sound of something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The scraping continued, but this time it was followed by a low, almost inaudible whisper. It was a woman's voice, and it was speaking in soft, broken sentences. The words were unclear, but the tone was filled with something desperate, something that made my blood run cold. I slowly sat up, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I was dreaming or if the sounds were real. But when I looked around the room, everything seemed exactly as it had been before, except for the unsettling feeling that the air was heavier now. The whispering grew louder, and I could now hear a few distinct words, though they were still hard to understand. "Help me, please." The sound of footsteps followed the whisper, slow and deliberate, moving across the room in a way that sent chills down my spine. I stared at the corner of the room where the noises were coming from, but there was nothing there. No one standing, no shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence, but I knew something had changed. I could feel it in my bones. The atmosphere in the room felt thick, as if someone, was watching me. I quickly grabbed my phone and checked the time, 12:30 a.m. My hands were shaking as I sent a message to a friend, telling them about the strange happenings. I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep now, not with that eerie feeling hanging over me. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, dimming for a moment before coming back on. And then, in the reflection of the mirror above the dresser, I saw something. A shadow, a figure standing just behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing. The temperature in the room had dropped again, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The whispers started again, but this time they were clearer, louder, almost frantic. "Don't leave. Please, don't leave me." I ran to the door, desperate to get out, but the door wouldn't open. The handle refused to turn, as if someone on the other side was holding it shut. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear the soft, scraping sound again, closer this time, as if whatever was in the room with me was moving toward me. I turned back to the room, desperate to find a way out. My eyes fell on the photograph from earlier, the black and white photo of the couple. The man in the picture was smiling, but his eyes were no longer dark and hollow. They were glowing, staring at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Help me, help me." The voice was almost a scream now, and I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the window, hoping to break it open and escape that way, but the glass was old and stubborn. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls seeming to grow closer with each passing second. Finally, in a desperate attempt to escape, I screamed for help, hoping someone, anyone, could hear me. But no one answered. The hotel, it seemed, was silent once again. The whispers ceased, the room grew still, and finally, the door clicked open on its own. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my bags, bolted out of the room, and ran down the stairs. When I reached the front desk, the man who had checked me in was still there, sitting silently. "Did you hear anything?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his eyes vacant. "It's the hotel," he said simply. "She doesn't like guests." I didn't stay to hear more. I left without another word, not looking back. I've never returned to the Drake house. I don't think I ever will. Some places are best left untouched. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way. I had been traveling alone for a week, chasing the quiet corners of the country for some peace of mind. I was sick of the city's constant noise and the way my life seemed to be moving faster than I could keep up with. So, when I stumbled upon the town of Maplewood, I knew I had found the perfect place to spend a night and recharge. Maplewood was a sleepy town, nestled in the mountains, where the streets were lined with old, stone houses and trees whose branches had grown thick with age. The town felt like something out of a bygone era, untouched by modern life. There was one thing that stood out from the rest: the Ashford Hotel. The hotel was grand, even in its old age. It had once been a luxurious retreat for the wealthy, but now it was more of a historical landmark, a relic of the past. The paint on the exterior was peeling, and the windows had a layer of grime on them, but it still had a certain charm. It looked like it had been waiting for someone to walk through its doors for decades, and when I saw the vacancy sign hanging outside, I knew it was calling me in. I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, which groaned in protest as they opened, revealing the grand lobby. The space was dimly lit, with an old chandelier hanging from the ceiling, its crystals sparkling faintly in the low light. The wallpaper was faded, but the intricate patterns were still visible, telling stories of a time when the hotel had been the heart of Maplewood. An old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, its chimes echoing through the silence. Behind the desk stood a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose. His face was expressionless as he looked up from his book and greeted me. "Welcome to the Ashford," he said. "How can I help you?" "Just a room for the night," I said. "Nothing fancy." He nodded and handed me a brass key, its weight surprising in my hand. "Room 217. It's on the second floor. You can take the elevator or the stairs." I thanked him and made my way toward the elevator, which creaked as it moved. The entire building seemed to groan with age. As I ascended to the second floor, I felt a strange chill in the air. The elevator stopped with a soft jolt, and I stepped out into the narrow hallway. The second floor was quieter than I expected, and the air felt thicker here, as though the building had absorbed the stories of those who had stayed there over the years. The floors were covered in a faded carpet, and the walls were lined with portraits of people I couldn't recognize. The lighting was dim, and the place had an odd stillness that made me uneasy. I found room 217 at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was large but dimly lit, with a heavy, four-poster bed in the center. There was an old-fashioned dresser against one wall, and a large mirror hanging above it. The wallpaper was the same faded pattern as the rest of the hotel, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I immediately noticed something odd. There was a portrait hanging on the wall next to the bed. It was an oil painting of a woman, dressed in a gown that looked like it belonged to the 1800s. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. The most unsettling part was the way she seemed to be staring directly at me, no matter where I moved in the room. Her gaze followed me, and it made my skin crawl. I figured it was just a weird painting that had been left behind when the hotel fell out of its prime. I shrugged it off, unpacked my things, and settled into bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first few hours were fine. I watched some television, checked my phone, and started to doze off. But as the night wore on, the room began to change. The air grew colder, and the silence that had once been soothing began to feel suffocating. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to shake off the feeling that someone was watching. I turned off the lamp and lay in the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the dim light coming through the window. It was then that I heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but it stopped before I could make out the words. Then I heard it again, but this time it was louder. It was coming from the portrait. The woman in the painting was no longer just staring at me. Her lips were moving. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, staring at the painting. The woman's mouth was moving in slow, deliberate movements, like she was trying to speak. But there were no words, just a soft murmur that seemed to fill the room. I couldn't take it any longer. I rushed over to the painting, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the frame, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me. The whispers grew louder, now almost deafening. I could make out the words this time, though they were still hard to understand. "Help me, please. Don't leave me alone." I pulled my hand away from the painting, and the room seemed to go still again. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispers faded. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it the wind? Or was something more sinister at work? I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just the old building, settling and creaking. I sat down on the bed, took a deep breath, and tried to force myself to relax. But something felt horribly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was alive, that something was lurking just beyond my vision. I turned to look at the portrait again. The woman's eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of sorrow, and her expression seemed to change. Her lips trembled, as though she was struggling to speak, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to tell me something. Then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw her blink. I froze, unable to move. The woman's face twisted into an expression of pure terror, her eyes wide and pleading. I stumbled backward, falling into the armchair near the window. "Help me," I heard her whisper again, but this time, it was clear. It was a voice, alive, real, and filled with desperation. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, down the hallway, and back to the lobby. The man at the front desk looked up from his book as I approached. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to control my voice. "I need to leave. Right now." He gave me a confused look. "Is everything all right, sir?" I can't stay here. Something's wrong with the room," I stammered. "Please, I need to check out." He seemed taken aback but nodded. "Very well," he said slowly. "But you're not the first to feel that way. Room 217. It's been like that for years. We've had guests leave in the middle of the night." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He glanced around the lobby as if to make sure no one else was listening. "That room, it's haunted. No one really knows who she was. Some say she was a guest who stayed here years ago, but others believe she's something else entirely. All I know is that no one ever feels right in that room." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my things and left the Ashford Hotel, not looking back once. The night air felt refreshing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I never did return to Maplewood, and I've never stayed in a hotel like that again. I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes, quiet, desperate calls for help from a woman whose story has never been told. Some rooms are better left undisturbed, and some portraits should never be stared at too long. I had been on the road for weeks, traveling through small towns and staying in random motels. It was a break I desperately needed, or at least I thought I did. My life back home had been chaotic. Work stress, a broken relationship, and a general feeling of being lost. I figured a solo road trip would help me clear my head. But when I pulled into the small, sleepy town of Willowbrook, I didn't expect the strange and unnerving encounter I would soon face at the Oakwood Hotel. The Oakwood Hotel was located at the edge of the town, just off the main street. From the outside, it looked like a grand place, though it had clearly seen better days. The dark red brick walls were weathered and chipped, the windows were cloudy with age, and the wooden sign hanging above the door swung in the wind. Still, there was something oddly comforting about it, like stepping into another time. I had no reservations, but I was tired and needed a place to stay. As I walked through the old wooden door, a soft chime rang out, followed by the sound of footsteps coming from behind the front desk. An older man with thinning gray hair and a weary look on his face stood behind it. "Evening," he said with a slow, southern drawl. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I'm looking for a room for the night," I replied. He looked me over for a moment, as if sizing me up, then nodded. "Sure thing. We've got a few rooms available. Most of them are upstairs, but we do have one on the 3rd floor. Room 312. Would that be all right?" I thought for a moment, but it didn't matter. I was too tired to care. "Room 312 sounds fine." The man handed me an old brass key, its surface worn from years of use. He gave me a strange look as I took it, almost like he was trying to tell me something without saying it aloud. "Room 312, he repeated, his voice almost a warning. "It's a quiet room. You'll be left alone, I reckon." I felt a twinge of unease, but dismissed it as just my imagination running wild. Hotels like this one were old, with a lot of history. Sometimes that made people act a little strange. I nodded and thanked him before heading upstairs. The staircase creaked under my weight, each step groaning as though the building itself was protesting my presence. The air smelled musty, and the lights flickered in the hallway as I walked down to room 312. There was no one else around, no sounds of other guests, which was odd for a hotel this size. Room 312 was at the far end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was simple, with an antique bed covered in a faded quilt, a worn-out armchair, and a dresser that looked like it belonged in a museum. The walls were painted a dull, pale yellow, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. The window, which overlooked the small courtyard, was cracked slightly, letting in the cool evening air. I threw my suitcase onto the bed and sat down, letting out a deep breath. The quiet was almost suffocating, but it also gave me the chance to think. I thought about my past, about what I had left behind. I wondered if I could really start over, or if I was just running away from the mess I'd made. It wasn't long before I started feeling the oddness of the place sink in. There was something off about the room. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it felt oppressive. The air seemed too still, too thick, and the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. At first, I brushed it off as just the unfamiliarity of the hotel, but then I heard it. A soft, dragging sound came from somewhere behind the wall. It was subtle at first, like a light scratching, followed by the faintest sound of someone breathing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood up and walked toward the wall, pressing my ear against it, but the sound stopped as soon as I touched it. I shook my head. It was probably just an old building settling, I thought, but still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but the images flickered strangely, as if the screen were trying to show something, then quickly cutting to static. The silence in the room grew heavier. As night fell, I tried to shake off the dread that seemed to hang in the air. I had a long drive ahead of me tomorrow, and I needed rest. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up, and tried to drift off to sleep. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The clock on the nightstand read 2:13 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a noise, a thud, coming from the hallway. I sat up in bed, heart racing. It was followed by another sound, this time a light tapping, like someone was walking up and down the hall in heavy boots. I listened carefully, but there were no voices, just the steady tapping sound, echoing from the hallway. I got up and stepped into the hall, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The hallway was completely dark, with only the dim glow of the emergency exit signs providing any light. I couldn't see anyone. The tapping had stopped. I walked to the end of the hall, where a staircase led to the floor below, but there was no one there. Just the silence. But as I turned back toward room 312, I saw something that made my stomach twist. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the stairs, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and dressed in a dark coat. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape, standing perfectly still. The figure didn't move, just stared into the darkness, as though waiting for something. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I knew I should have gone back to my room, locked the door, and forgotten about it. but I was frozen, unable to take my eyes off the figure. The silence stretched on, and then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slow, deliberate steps echoed in the empty hall as it began to walk toward me, its form growing clearer with each step. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow, but his presence was overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my feet unwilling to obey. The man kept coming closer until he was just a few feet away from me. And then, just as he seemed about to reach out, he vanished. He didn't fade away slowly, like a ghost might. He simply disappeared, as though he had never been there at all. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I thought it might explode. I scrambled back to my room, locked the door, and threw myself under the covers. I didn't dare look at the clock. I didn't want to know what time it was. I just wanted the night to end. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure, standing just outside my door, watching me. But each time I opened my eyes, he was gone. The night felt endless. In the morning, I checked out of the Oakwood Hotel as quickly as I could. The man behind the desk gave me a knowing look, but said nothing as I handed him the key to room 312. "Did you have a good stay?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. I nodded, but my throat was dry. "Yeah, I guess," I managed to say. As I turned to leave, I heard him mutter under his breath, "Room 312. She never lets anyone leave the same way they came in." I froze. I turned back around, but he was already looking at the guest book, not meeting my eyes. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He just looked up at me with sad eyes, as if he knew exactly what I had experienced but was too weary to share the details. I never returned to Willowbrook, and I still don't know exactly what happened that night. But I've heard stories about the Oakwood Hotel since then. People say room 312 is cursed, that it holds the restless spirit of a woman who died there many years ago. And some say she's still waiting for someone to join her. But I don't need to hear any more stories. I know what I felt, and I'll never forget the figure in the hallway, waiting in the darkness. The Elms Hotel had always been a place of legend in the small town of Carver's Hollow. It sat at the end of Main Street, surrounded by old trees whose gnarled branches seemed to whisper secrets to each other. The hotel, a Victorian building with high arched windows, towering spires, and dark wood paneling, had once been the pride of the town. But now, it was mostly forgotten. Its grand rooms faded and its chandeliers covered in dust. The new, more modern hotels had taken over, and the Elms had been left to the shadows of time. But to me, it was the perfect stop on my road trip. I was an adventurous soul, always seeking the unknown, the mysterious. I had heard a few rumors about the hotel, whispers of strange occurrences, strange voices, and strange things happening to guests who dared to stay too long. But those were just stories, right? I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in anything supernatural. So, when I pulled into the parking lot of the Elms Hotel, I felt no more unease than I would have at any other place. The grand front doors creaked as I pushed them open, and I entered the dimly lit lobby. The place was quiet, almost eerily so, but that was to be expected from a hotel this old. The floorboards groaned underfoot as I approached the front desk. Behind the counter was a young woman, probably in her 20s, with short brown hair and tired eyes. She looked up as I approached, her expression softening a little. "Hello. How can I help you?" she asked politely. "I need a room for the night," I said, smiling. "Nothing fancy." She glanced at the reservation book, and after a brief moment, she nodded. "We have one room left. It's room 211. It's on the second floor. Will that work for you?" I was tired from the long drive, and I nodded quickly. "Perfect. I'll take it." The woman handed me an old brass key and pointed toward the stairs. "The elevator's not working right now, so you'll have to take the stairs. Room 211 is just down the hall." I thanked her and made my way up the creaky staircase, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. There was something unsettling about the quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. As I reached the second floor, I noticed how the air seemed a little colder, a little thicker. The walls, covered in faded floral wallpaper, looked almost like they were closing in on me. The hallway stretched out, empty and silent, save for the faint hum of the old lights flickering above. Room 211 was at the very end of the hall. I hesitated for a moment before inserting the key into the door. It clicked open with a low sound, and I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and at first glance, it looked like any other old hotel room. The bed was covered in a thick quilt with floral patterns, and the furniture was heavy and dark, made of wood that had clearly seen better days. The windows were large, but the curtains were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the little light from the street below. There was a faint musty smell in the air, and the floor was covered with a thick rug that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I placed my suitcase on the bed and glanced around, taking it all in. It was certainly not a place I would have chosen had I known more about it, but it was fine for a quick rest. I decided to explore the hotel a bit before settling in for the night. As I walked down the hall, I noticed something strange. The wallpaper in some of the rooms seemed to have patterns that didn't match the rest of the hallway. Swirls, shapes, and images that didn't quite belong. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It felt like the hotel had been patched up over the years, and the repairs had never been made to look the same. The hotel seemed off, as if something had been left behind. I returned to my room, a strange feeling creeping over me, but I dismissed it. It was just an old building, nothing more. That night, after taking a long shower, I turned off the lights and crawled into bed. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and the sheets felt cold against my skin. It took a while for me to fall asleep, my mind racing with thoughts about my upcoming travels. But eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off into a restless slumber. I was awoken sometime in the middle of the night by a sound, soft, barely audible at first. It was a whispering noise, like a distant conversation. I opened my eyes, squinting into the darkness of the room, but there was nothing there. The whispering seemed to come from the walls themselves, a sound just beyond hearing, like someone was speaking through the wood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I convinced myself it was just the building settling. But then, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just voices, it was words. I couldn't make them out, but it was clear they were speaking directly to me. My heart started to pound in my chest. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide in the dark, searching for the source of the sound. There was nothing visible, nothing moving. The whispering continued, and now, it felt like it was right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and my body froze in fear. I reached over to the bedside lamp and flicked the switch, flooding the room with light. And then, it stopped. The room was eerily still, and I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought maybe I had imagined it, or that the building was just old and making strange noises. But then, I saw something that sent ice through my veins. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow, tall, thin, and elongated. It seemed to shift and stretch, as though it didn't belong to any natural shape. The shadow flickered in the light, but no source of it could be found. My breath caught in my throat, and I struggled to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow seemed to move closer, its edges growing sharper, like it was solidifying into something more tangible. The whispers returned, this time clearer, more insistent. "Leave this place, leave now." I scrambled out of bed and ran to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. As I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the temperature dropped. My breath misted in the cold air, and the hallway seemed darker, more oppressive than before. The shadows in the hall seemed to stretch longer, more twisted, as if they were alive. I made my way down the hall, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to get away from room 211. The whispering followed me, growing louder with each step. "Leave, leave, leave." I reached the staircase and ran down it, my heart racing, my legs carrying me faster than I ever thought possible. I burst into the lobby, but the woman who had checked me in earlier was gone. The lobby was empty, the fireplace cold and dark. The only sound was the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. I rushed to the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't explain what had happened in that room, but I knew I couldn't stay another minute. The next morning, I drove out of Carver's Hollow without looking back. But even now, I can still hear the whispers sometimes. The low murmur of voices, the insistent calling that seems to come from nowhere. I know it's not just in my head. There's something in that hotel, something that wants to keep people there, to trap them in its walls forever. If you ever find yourself in Carver's Hollow, don't even think about staying at the Elms Hotel. The whispers in the walls are real, and they're waiting for the next guest to arrive. I'd heard the rumors before I checked into the Marlowe Hotel, but I didn't believe them. After all, it was just an old hotel. You know the type. Creaky floors, faded wallpaper, a little dusty, but nothing unusual. The kind of place where you could get a cheap room on the road for the night. What could possibly go wrong? It was late in the evening when I arrived in the small, sleepy town of Westbrook. I was on a cross-country road trip, driving through unfamiliar towns, trying to clear my head after a breakup. The Marlowe Hotel was one of the first places I saw when I entered town, standing tall and proud at the end of the street. Its large Victorian windows stared down at me as I parked in front of the building. The hotel had an aura of old-world charm, despite the obvious signs of neglect. The walls were a dull, faded yellow, and the once grand ironwork on the balcony was now chipped and rusted. A sign above the door, written in elegant script, read, "The Marlowe Hotel, EST 1885. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I pushed open the heavy door, I felt a strange chill sweep over me. The lobby was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of an antique chandelier that hung from the ceiling. The air was thick, almost as if the building had been holding its breath for years. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the front desk. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing an old-fashioned hotel uniform. His face was tired, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in years. He looked at me with a strange mix of curiosity and wariness, like he had seen too many strange things in this place over the years. "Good evening," he said, his voice soft but gruff. "How can I help you?" "Hi, I need a room for the night," I replied, feeling the weight of his stare. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere to sleep." He hesitated for a moment, then slid a key across the counter. "Room 406, top floor. It's quiet up there. You'll have a good night's sleep." His words struck me as a little too pointed, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just trying to be friendly. I took the key, thanked him, and made my way up to the 4th floor. The elevator creaked and groaned as it carried me up, but when I arrived at the top floor, I was greeted by silence. The hallway was narrow, the walls adorned with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. The carpets were worn and threadbare, the edges curling at the seams. Room 406 was at the far end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was large, but it was obvious it hadn't been updated in decades. The bed had an old brass frame, the mattress sagging in the middle. The curtains were drawn shut, and a thick layer of dust covered the furniture. Despite the room's age, it had an eerie charm about it, like a forgotten time capsule. I threw my suitcase on the bed and sat down, surveying the room. The furniture looked antique, probably worth something if anyone cared enough to restore it. A small brass bell sat on the nightstand, its bell top tarnished with age. I couldn't help but smile at how quaint it seemed, so out of place in today's world of cell phones and digital devices. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange, though. The bell was sitting in the center of the nightstand, and the air in the room suddenly felt colder. I stood up and walked over to the window to crack it open, hoping to let in some fresh air. As I did, I felt a sudden gust behind me, a rush of cold air that seemed to come from nowhere. When I turned around, I saw that the bell had shifted on its own, as if it had been moved slightly to the left. I froze, staring at it, a chill creeping up my spine. The bell was clearly not where it had been before. I didn't touch it. It was as if it had moved by itself. I shook my head, dismissing it as a draft or the result of an old building shifting. But then, I heard a soft sound, a delicate, high-pitched ringing, like a faint bell tolling from the distance. It was so quiet at first, I thought I might have imagined it. But then, it rang again, louder this time, right next to my ear. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing in the room. The bell on the nightstand was perfectly still, yet the sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the bell had come to life, ringing without anyone touching it. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room grew heavier, more oppressive, and a sudden sense of dread filled the space. The ringing grew louder, more frantic, as if someone, or something, was desperately trying to get my attention. And then, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was plunged into complete darkness, and the ringing continued, now louder than ever, echoing through the walls. My hands fumbled to turn on the lamp, but it flickered and went out. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, as if someone on the other side had sealed it shut. I was trapped. In the darkness, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a low hum just beyond my hearing, but gradually growing clearer. I could hear faint voices now, murmuring in the shadows. The words were unintelligible, but they were getting closer. Something, or someone, was in the room with me. I backed up against the wall, my breath quickening. The voices were growing louder, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, right before my eyes, the bell on the nightstand began to ring on its own again. This time, it was louder than ever, its metallic chime ringing out with a deafening sound. The voices seemed to respond to the bell, as if it was calling them. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen eyes, was suffocating. Just as I thought I might lose my mind, the door to the room swung open on its own. The hallway outside was bathed in a faint light, and I bolted for it without a second thought. As I ran down the hall, I could hear the bell ringing behind me, the sound echoing down the corridors. I reached the stairs and rushed down to the lobby, my heart racing. The man who had checked me in was sitting behind the desk, but his eyes were vacant, as if he had been waiting for me to return. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked in a soft voice, his gaze never leaving mine. I nodded, my mouth dry. "What is that sound? What's happening?" The man's face twisted into a sad smile. "It's the bell," he said. "It rings when it's time. Time for someone to join the others." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Join who? What are you talking about?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "The bell rings when the spirits of the hotel need a new guest. When someone is chosen." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Chosen for what?" The man sighed, as though tired from explaining the same thing countless times. "The bell doesn't stop ringing until the soul has been claimed." I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. I didn't want to hear any more. I just wanted to leave, to never look back. I ran out the door, into the cold night air, and didn't stop until I was miles away from the Marlowe Hotel. To this day, I still can't explain what happened. I've heard rumors from others who have stayed at the Marlowe Hotel, some saying they've heard the bell ringing in the dead of night, others claiming they've seen figures moving through the hallways. I don't know if it's the spirits of the hotel or something more sinister that lingers in that old place. But one thing is certain, the bell at the Marlowe Hotel isn't just a relic of the past. It's an invitation, and once it starts ringing, you'd better hope you're not the one it's calling. I've always been a sucker for old hotels. There's something about them, the faded grandeur, the stories they hold within their walls, that draws me in. But the Marlowe Hotel was different. There was an unsettling atmosphere about the place that I couldn't quite shake. I had checked in with nothing more than a sense of adventure, unaware that I was about to experience something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a quiet, foggy evening when I arrived in the town of Blackwater. The Marlowe Hotel stood at the corner of the main street, towering above the small, sleepy town. The hotel had been around for over a century, and while it had seen better days, it still held a certain charm. Its brick walls, once a deep shade of red, were now faded and cracked. The windows, though large and grand, were coated with a thin layer of grime. Despite the obvious age, the hotel had an almost regal air to it. I parked my car outside and walked through the large, double doors. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I felt it, a strange, heavy presence, like the building itself was watching me. The lobby was dimly lit, with old chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and antique furniture scattered about. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something older, like the scent of forgotten memories. Behind the desk was a tall, gaunt man with sharp features. His eyes were hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days, and his skin was pale, almost sickly. He greeted me with a nod but didn't speak, as if he expected me to know exactly what to do. "Room for one?" he asked, his voice dry and crackling. I nodded. "Just for the night." He glanced down at the register, running his finger across the pages before pulling out an old brass key. "Room 309. It's on the 3rd floor. Be careful of the stairs. They're uneven." He handed me the key without another word. I thanked him and made my way to the elevator. It was an old thing, the kind with the iron gate that you had to pull open by hand. The metal groaned as it ascended to the 3rd floor. The elevator doors opened with a loud clang, and I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Room 309 was at the far end of the corridor, and as I walked toward it, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling, and the floorboards creaked with every step. I reached the door and inserted the key, unlocking it with a click. The room was just as old as the rest of the hotel, with heavy curtains drawn over the windows, blocking out most of the light. The furniture was antique, the bedspread a faded floral pattern that seemed to match the wallpaper. There was an old armchair in the corner and a small, round table by the window. But what caught my attention wasn't the furniture. It was the strange painting on the wall. It was a portrait of a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes dark and hollow. She was dressed in a black Victorian gown, and her expression was one of sadness, almost as though she was trapped in the frame. The painting was unsettling, but I couldn't look away. There was something about her, something that made me feel like she was watching me, even though I knew it was just a painting. I shook off the unease and tossed my bag on the bed. I decided to explore the hotel a bit before settling in for the night. I left the room and wandered down the hall, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The hotel seemed so quiet, like it was frozen in time. The air was thick with the weight of history, and the silence was almost suffocating. As I walked past room 310, I heard a faint sound, soft, like a whisper. I paused, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I chalked it up to the old building settling, though it felt like something more. I continued down the hall until I reached the staircase that led to the upper floors. The stairs were uneven, just as the man at the front desk had warned me. They creaked and groaned as I ascended, and the dim light from the landing barely illuminated the steps. I reached the top and looked around, but the hallway on the 4th floor was empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. It was as if the hotel was alive, watching, waiting. After a few minutes of wandering, I decided to return to my room. I walked back down the hall and turned the corner, only to stop dead in my tracks. At the end of the hall stood the woman from the painting. She was there, in the flesh, pale, gaunt, and dressed in the same black gown. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted in a grotesque grimace. She stood motionless, staring at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she was about to speak. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the woman's haunting gaze. The air grew colder, and the hallway seemed to stretch longer, as if the walls were closing in around me. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Leave, before it's too late." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short gasps. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. a result of the eerie atmosphere of the hotel. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. As the night dragged on, the silence in the room became oppressive. The only sound was the soft ticking of the old clock on the nightstand. But then, I heard it, a faint, echoing knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat. I slowly got out of bed and approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound, but the knocking had stopped. I opened the door cautiously, peering into the hallway. It was empty. No one was there. The air felt colder, heavier than before. I stepped into the hall, looking both ways, but there was nothing. Nothing except the strange, faint echo that seemed to come from every corner of the hotel. I turned and went back to my room, locking the door behind me. I felt the oppressive weight of the silence pressing in on me. And then, as I lay back down in bed, I heard it again, the whispering. It wasn't in the hallway this time. It was right next to me, in the room, as if someone was standing beside my bed. "Leave now, or you will be trapped here forever." The voice was cold, distant, and yet unmistakably real. I sat up, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the shadows stretching across the walls like dark fingers. But I knew the hotel wasn't empty. It wasn't just old wood and stone. It was alive, filled with the restless spirits of the past. I couldn't stay any longer. I grabbed my things, heart pounding in my chest, and rushed out of the room, down the hall, and out of the hotel. The cold air outside felt like a welcome relief, but the image of the woman from the painting, her hollow eyes and cold warning, stayed with me. I never returned to the Marlowe Hotel, and I never will. I've heard rumors since then, rumors of other guests who've checked into room 309, only to disappear without a trace. The hotel has long since fallen into disrepair, and no one dares to go near it. Some say the hotel is cursed, others claim it's haunted by the souls of those who never left. But I know the truth. The Marlowe Hotel is a place where the echoes of the past never fade, where the restless spirits wait for the next guest to fall victim to their cold grip. If you ever find yourself in Blackwater, do yourself a favor. Keep driving, no matter how tempting the Marlowe Hotel may seem. The woman in the painting is still waiting for you. And once she calls, you may never leave.